Hi everyone, please subscribe to my channel. Blood Immortal Venerable. See playlist for other chapters and novels. I do not translate the novels. Credits goes to original translator and author of the novel. I only make it as an audiobook so it would be easier to just listen while doing other things. Credits goes to the author of the novel. I convert stories to audiobook for mental health, for multitasking purpose, for accessibility and time saving. Listening to audiobook is also beneficial for people who have disability. It improves our listening skills and improve our English comprehension, vocabulary and other things. So, thank you for listening. Thank you and thank you very much for your support. Chapter 961, A Love Story. When Zen withdrew his perception from the book, he discovered that Letitia, Margaret and Aura had also released their perceptions into the book under the old man's guidance. They were standing blankly by the side of the book. This meant that right now, they should be wandering within the chaotic storm chronicle. After a long time, the three women also withdrew themselves from the book, their eyes filled with endless shock. They had seen the same things he had. In fact, they were also unable to understand the book. They knew what it said, but what it implied was far beyond them. The world that the book depicted had shocked them greatly. They couldn't help but wonder just how powerful the writer of the book was. When Immortal Book saw their expressions, he looked extremely satisfied, as if that was exactly what he wanted. As the person in charge of the library, he had scrolled through almost all of the books in the library, and it was said that he found an endless amount of joy in sharing them with anyone who came this way. In these long years, he had roamed the ocean of books and had seen many profound secrets. He wanted to share his thoughts with others, but there was no one that he could communicate with. It was indeed a pity. Of course he knew that the people in front of him were completely shocked by the primal chaos, and he felt extremely happy in his heart. He then told them, the chaotic storm chronicle is just a drop in the bucket when you are in this library. The things left behind by our master are all treasures and extremely valuable ones. If you want to read these books one by one, you will need many years to finish reading them all. Come on, I'll recommend a few more to you guys. Zen, Letitia and Aura were looking forward to it. However, Margaret pursed her lips and pouted, that was just a hazy world. It was boring. I guess whatever you recommend will be boring as well. What? Hearing Margaret say that, Immortal Book was unhappy. It was as if she had treated the most important thing in his eyes as rubbish. This was something he could not tolerate, so he spat out, young girl, what nonsense are you talking about? The books in this library are as numerous as the stars in the sky, and there will always be books that are suitable for you. What kind of book do you like? I will find it for you. Margaret had just flipped through the chaotic storm chronicle. Although she was also incomparably shocked, she didn't like such kind of book. Now that Immortal Book wanted to recommend a book to her, she smiled cunningly and remarked, I'm afraid that there is not a single book that I would like in here. Humph. Immortal Book snorted and pulled a long face. That can't be true. You name it, and I will have it. If I can't find a book you like, then I won't be worthy of the title of Immortal Book. Seeing that Immortal Book did not look happy, Zen also told Margaret, Margaret, don't speak carelessly. Unexpectedly, Immortal Book told Zen, don't worry. I don't mind. I'm not angry, I'm just not convinced. Girl, just tell me. Margaret blinked a few times before opening her mouth and saying something no one had expected. I like reading love stories. I presume this place doesn't have that kind of book. Zen and the other two women were rendered speechless. Zen could only shake his head with a bitter smile. As for Letitia, her face was expressionless as she had already guessed that Margaret would come up with some strange request. Aura, however, covered her mouth and giggled. This woman really is a hopeless romantic, she thought. In the ethereal city, where Margaret had lived all her life, there were numerous scholars. Some of them would often write novels when they were free. Even though these novels were not considered as a refined art, they circulated among the women of the society for their romantic aspect. When she was at the She clan's house, Margaret would often send her servant to buy some novels for entertainment when she had nothing better to do. That was just one of the many things she did to pass her time since she was totally not interested in cultivation. As for Letitia and Aura, one was the leader of the Cloud Hall itself, and the other was a master from the Cloud sect. Normally, they were busy with cultivation and business, so how would they find the time to read novels or love stories? Hearing Margaret's request, Immortal Book was also stunned. Then, he raised his head and laughed, saying, Girl, come with me. There really is one? Margaret asked in surprise. Immortal Book didn't answer her question. He only brought her to a bookshelf towards their left. With a gentle wave of his finger, a huge book slowly fell down from the bookshelf. Zen's eyebrows shot up at Immortal Book's ability. This book had been brought by Immortal Book himself without any effort at all. Clearly, its weight, just like the previous one, was equivalent to a mountain range, yet Immortal Book had taken it down so easily. Terrifying strength was revealed everywhere in this fairy palace. Even a person in charge of the library had the sort of strength that Zen could not even imagine. Under the guidance of Immortal Book, Margaret stood in front of the book and quickly immersed her perception into it. As for Zen, Letitia and Aura, they were curious as to what sort of love story the fairy palace might hold, so they also followed her into the world inside the book. After a long while, everyone left the book. By that time, Margaret was already in tears. Her nose was sniffling and her eyes were in a daze as if she were still immersed in the story. The story seemed to be a sad one. Aura's expression also revealed sadness. She was also moved by the story that was written in the book. Even Letitia was lost in thought. In the past, she had always buried herself in cultivation, and had never come across such a romantic story before. So the impact on her should have been the greatest. However, her warrior spirit was firm, and although she was moved by the tragedy that lay within the book, she was able to control herself, unlike Margaret. As for Zen, his face was filled with helplessness. He was completely confused by what was going on and wasn't moved by the story at all. If Margaret were still in her senses, she would say that this guy was hopeless. As Margaret sobbed, she actually threw herself into Zen's arms. Oh Zen, the woman in this book has such a tragic story. I don't want to read any more of these stories in the future. Girl, do you still want to see more of these kinds of stories? Immortal Book revealed a complacent expression. Margaret wiped her tears away and asked in surprise, are there more of these? Zen was once again left speechless when he saw Margaret's reaction. He would have thought that she wouldn't want to see any more. Immortal Book had chosen a few more books for Margaret, and she was immersed in one of those. Then Zen asked, Immortal Book, are there any books about cultivation methods in the library? Immortal Book laughed and said, of course there are. The library contains books about a myriad of things. How could it not have some about cultivation methods? Come with me. After saying that, Immortal Book rode on a cloud and brought Zen and the remaining two women deeper into the library. Saul also followed behind. As for Margaret, Zen was going to let her cry for a while. When Zen had mentioned cultivation methods, Letitia's and Aura's eyes had lit up. Letitia knew that the Sutra of Empyrean Goddess she had cultivated was only an incomplete one and that she needed to practice a lot more. Although she wanted to follow in Zen's footsteps in terms of cultivation and strength, it looked like the gap between them was widening day by day. If she could find a suitable cultivation method in this library, she would be more than willing to obtain it and get closer to her husband. In reality, she had thought about the future that she and Zen had, much more than Margaret had done. It was not until the old man had reminded Margaret about her powers that she then realized that Zen would ascend to the upper world. But Letitia had long known about this and was getting ready to follow him. If she couldn't keep up with his pace, she would be left alone in the lower world in the future. Of course, she wasn't willing for that to happen. This library was definitely an opportunity for her and she wouldn't miss it. As for Aura, she was not as far-sighted as Letitia was. However, she only had one thought in her heart. She did not want to catch up to Zen's level of cultivation, but only wanted to be able to follow him. The library was surprisingly large and could almost be considered bigger on the inside. Each bookshelf was equivalent to a mountain. They weaved through the bookshelves, as if strolling inside a valley. As they walked, Immortal Book told them, these books were also written by our master. These are travel notes. These are verses and ditties. These are odes and songs. These are. After a long while, Immortal Book stopped in his tracks and said, these are the cultivation methods which were created by our master. All of the cultivation methods in this row are suitable for women. Zen's eyes flashed at the words of Immortal Book. He then asked, I wonder if there is any transcendent divine might among these cultivation methods. Chapter 962, Falling Books. When Immortal Book heard Zen's words, he chuckled. Bewildered, Zen asked, what are you laughing at? Saul, who was staying beside Zen, looked impatient and grunted, this old man has read too many books and likes to put on an act like this. Immortal Book just snorted at Saul and was not even bothered to quibble with him at all, but he quickly disclosed, there is no good or bad cultivation methods in the world. And the transcendent divine might you're referring to must be related to the law of causality. That kind of cultivation methods are extremely rare, but yes, we do have some. Taking in all the information Immortal Book had revealed, Zen then queried the Cyan Dragon in his mind, as all transcendent divine might related to the law of causality. Zen only realized that the law of causality was so powerful soon after he took hold of Black Star. At that time, Zen was still practicing the stellar body. But until now, he hadn't finished the first half part of it yet. So he had no understanding as to whether the stellar body had some kind of correlation with the law of causality or not. When Zen entered the fairy palace, the cyan dragon was also extremely astonished by the diversity of things inside. He merely maintained his silence, but he snapped out of his musing when Zen threw him a question. He then commented, "Yes, you can say so. The law of causality is contained in the large majority of transcendent divine might. However, I only obtained the first half part of the stellar body, and the law of causality might be hidden in the second half part." "I see." Zen nodded. Immortal Book took a glance at Saul and seemed to be annoyed by the way how he described him. He then spoke amiably to Zen, "I know you want to choose a cultivation method suitable for yourself, but there are simply too many cultivation methods here. However, since the owner of this fairy palace has constructed such a large library, which is for the benefit of the later generations, he has told me the method of determining and selecting the suitable cultivation method for each warrior." With these words, he led Zen and the others to show the different row of shelves. Then glancing back to Letitia and Aura, he stated, "The cultivation methods on this row are suitable for women, so you two come over here." Letitia and Aura both looked at Zen's direction, who tilted his chin as if permitting them. Only then did the two ladies follow Immortal Book. Promptly, Immortal Book pointed to the ground and a circle of light became visible. Within that circle of light, there was a thin line that shot out continuously right from its edge. "Who wants to come in first?" Letitia's eyes flashed, and she immediately stepped into the light circle. As soon as Letitia was inside the light circle, the entire bookshelf started to shake non-stop. The mountainous bookshelf shook as if there was an earthquake. Bang! All the books on the bookshelf started to emit a faint golden light. After a while, a large book unforcedly came out from the top shelf and eventually landed in front of Letitia. Immortal Book gaped at her and then let out a laugh. "You are very lucky to get the Green Frost Mysterious Ice scripture. At the later stages of the cultivation method, you will find that it also contains the law of causality. I think it also belongs to the transcendent divine might that Zen mentioned." Judging by his words, Immortal Book disdained this so-called transcendent divine might. A gentle smile tugged at the corner of Zen's mouth after he listened to the exhilarated outburst of Immortal Book. He mused that although Immortal Book loved to show off, he was nicely accommodating. Apart from this, Zen also learned from the cyan dragon that the transcendent divine might was the best kind of cultivation methods in the universe. Since Letitia could get one transcendent divine might, she was in luck. Green Frost Mysterious Ice scripture. Letitia's face also beamed with excitement. "Is it that powerful?" Immortal Book glimpsed at Letitia briefly and then answered, "You cultivated the Sutra of Empyrean Goddess before and dispersed your cultivation base 9 times. So I must say, you indeed laid a good foundation for yourself. But the Sutra of Empyrean Goddess is not impeccable and not a complete cultivation method, and finishing it off will not be easy. So cultivating the Green Frost Mysterious Ice scripture is naturally 10 or 100 times better. You can enter the book and have a look to check whether what I say is correct or not." Letitia agreed. She realized that ever since she entered the fairy palace, there were many things she had seen that were so difficult for her to understand. Thus the cultivation methods in the library might surely be complicated. With this in her thoughts, she hastily immersed her perception into the Green Frost Mysterious Ice scripture in great anticipation. It was after 5 minutes when Letitia withdrew from the book. Her face wore an excited expression as she grabbed Zen's hand and said, "Zen, this cultivation method. Is this cultivation method good and suitable for you?" Zen smiled and asked her gently. "This cultivation method is perfectly tailor-made for me. On top of that, the mysteries contained within are all exceptionally marvelous." As the leader of Cloud Hall, Letitia had experienced a lot of major events. Whenever hearing her subordinates in the Cloud Hall report everything to her, Letitia could remain calm, no matter how important or urgent those matters were. However, she was so excited at this moment and couldn't control her emotion at all. Zen was now curious as to what kind of cultivation method the Green Frost Mysterious Ice scripture held, and how it had aroused so much excitement for Letitia. Only after a while did Letitia calm down. Just like Immortal Book had said, the Sutra of Empyrean Goddess she cultivated was to build a solid foundation for her. If she wanted to break through and make great progress, the Green Frost Mysterious Ice scripture was the most suitable cultivation method for her. Seeing that Letitia had regained her composure, Zen gently probed her, "You still haven't told me what happened to you." The corner of Letitia's mouth curved into a teasing smile, and she snorted. I might surpass you if I were to practice this cultivation method. Zen chuckled, then I'll have to do my best. While they were still engaged in their talk, a cultivation method had been chosen for Aura to practice. A large book slowly fell and landed beside her. Compared to Letitia, Aura was a little more indifferent towards the cultivation method that she got. What she obtained was a cultivation method with wind attribute. Even though Aura's expression was indifferent, she was as determined as Letitia. Knowing that both the resources and the cultivation methods in the eastern region were nothing as compared to those in the central region, she needed to push herself harder to catch up with the warriors in the latter. She desired to be as outstanding and powerful like them. Since the two women had chosen their cultivation methods, it was Zen's turn now. The cultivation methods on this row of bookshelves were suitable for women to cultivate. Now that it was time for Zen to choose a cultivation method, Immortal Book brought him further into the depths of the library. After stopping at another row of bookshelves, Immortal Book once again drew a circle of light on the floor and said to Zen, "You can go in now." Zen tilted his head and took a step into the light circle. Soon after, the entire bookshelf began to shake once again. Bang! This process was considered normal. As the bookshelves rumbled, a book at the second row of the shelves emerged. With an amused expression, Immortal Book exclaimed, "Not bad. It seems that the Heaven and Earth sword skill has chosen you." However, another large book from the bookshelf slowly moved out, halting Immortal Book in mid-sentence. Huh. At this moment, both Saul and Immortal Book looked surprised. There was no restriction imposed on selecting books in the library, so it was only appropriate for Zen to pick out a few more cultivation methods. Only Immortal Book could pick out the most suitable cultivation method for the warrior who wanted to choose one. Under normal circumstances, only one book would appear at one time, and now it seemed like there were two cultivation methods suitable for Zen to cultivate at the same time. It's rare to see two cultivation methods appearing at the same time, but I've seen such a scene before. Immortal Book's astonished expression immediately vanished as a faint smile appeared on his face again. However, just as he was done commenting, a third book on the bookshelf slowly moved, revealing half of it, seemingly to be about to fall from the bookshelf as well. The third book. Immortal Book's face now was wearing startled and amazed expression. Saul frowned and asked Immortal Book, "Does something wrong happen to your secret method? Why would three cultivation methods appear at the same time?" The secret method of Immortal Book was to help the warriors choose the most suitable cultivation methods for them. And there was usually one fitted for every warrior. Sometimes, there would be two books appearing, which could be because the warrior was almost equally good in two aspects. But now, three cultivation methods had appeared, and Saul suspected that there was something wrong with the secret method. Soon after Saul raised his suspicion, the other books also started to fall. The fourth book, the fifth book, the sixth book. Witnessing what was transpiring, there was a hint of fear emanating from Immortal Book. Back off. Chapter 963, a unique book. Each of the books was 30 feet tall standing upright, and the entire bookshelf in itself was basically a mountain, standing at least 10,000 feet tall. There were roughly 300 or so rows in a single bookshelf. So all in all, the books must have numbered in tens of thousands just on a bookshelf. At that moment, the massive books seemed to have begun being dumped from the bookshelf. With each book's weight equal to that of a mountain range, the huge crashes were rather horrifying. Holding out his hand, Immortal Book caught a few that were crashing down. Still, he couldn't support them all. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Knowing that they had to move quickly, Zen grabbed Aura and retreated with Letitia, Immortal Book, and Saul following after. By the time they escaped, the entire bookshelf was empty, all the books were strewn about the floor, piled up into a mountain. Idiot, I told you there was something wrong with your method. Saul shook his head in frustration. For a moment, all Immortal Book could do was stare at the scene before them in silence. Finally, he opened his mouth and said, "No, that's not the case." "What is it, then?" Saul returned, rolling his eyes at Immortal Book. The latter was in charge of the library, but it hadn't been opened for several years. Given what just happened, Saul was convinced that he was merely incompetent, having blown his chance after Zen finally got the library open. "I can hear these books," Immortal Book muttered. "All of the cultivation methods should be suitable for Zen." The words shocked Saul almost speechless. Impossible. All warriors had their strengths and weaknesses, without exception. When Zen first comprehended the law power, he was rather good at the space law, and then the others, most especially after the baptism by laws. Still, it had to be impossible for him to attract all the books on the bookshelf. Some of the cultivation methods were not divided by attributes, nor did they require warriors' comprehension of the laws. Some cultivation methods only required a certain level of the soul. There could only be one explanation: Zen was extremely balanced in every aspect and simply didn't have any weakness. But even so, it was unheard of to attract such a large volume of cultivation methods. Even with no weakness, he would stand out in only certain aspects. The method Immortal Book used was to pick out the cultivation method that suited Zen the most. Not all of them could be suitable to him. But no matter how baffled the others were, the truth was as such: the method used to find Zen's most suitable cultivation method had caused such a disaster. While the two bickered, Zen walked straight toward the mountain of books with a bitter smile on his face. "Which book should I get?" he asked. As the saying went, don't bite off more than you can chew. Zen was well aware of this. Immortal Book's method of selecting cultivation methods was indeed good, but it was basically useless on Zen. On the other hand, Letitia walked toward Zen and jokingly remarked, "Zen, you can cultivate them all." Zen merely rolled his eyes. Of course, it would be great if he could cultivate them all. The law of causality was nothing in his eyes, according to Immortal Book. So all the cultivation methods there couldn't hurt to choose. But when Zen looked over, he saw a single book on the bookshelf that had yet to fall. It was 30 feet tall and 20 feet wide as well, but it was thin. With all the other books having fallen out, it seemed like a strange sight as it remained alone on the bookshelf. Letitia noticed it as well. Why is there one that hasn't dropped yet? It must be a proud one as it refuses to let you learn it. Hey, what is that one about? Saul asked when he and Immortal Book took notice as well. Strange. Immortal Book examined it curiously. I've never seen that book before. His exclamation was followed by Saul's dramatic sigh. Having you stay in the library for so many years to become Immortal Book was in vain. Didn't you say you had read every single book in the library? Were you just boasting? Still, Immortal Book looked confused. With him being nearly immortal, he had gone over all the books in the library over and over. With confidence, he could claim to have flipped through each book at least 10,000 times. But this book was new to him. A chill crept up his spine. In the midst of all the questioning, Zen leapt onto the row where the book sat. Because it was on the 20th row, Zen flew up over 6,000 feet to reach it. Letitia and Aura slowly followed suit, with Immortal Book and Saul catching up eagerly. Reaching the end of the row, Zen examined the book carefully. The book was clearly different from the rest. All of the others had a rune on the cover. When Immortal Book activated these runes, he could infuse his perception into them and absorb the books easily. But the massive book in front of Zen didn't seem to have any kind of means to open it. With that thought, Zen put a careful hand on the book's cover. Since he couldn't use his perception to read it, he thought he could try opening it with his own strength. But with a single tap, the book didn't budge at all, leaving Zen with a frown. Then, the power of 2,000 dragon scales erupted. But the book refused to budge. 3,000 dragon scales. 4,000. 5,000. Still, the book remained motionless. It was as if the book were fake and could not be opened at all. "Let me open it. I'll do it." While Saul and Immortal Book would be stronger than Zen, he was taking control of the fairy palace step by step, meaning he could be considered their master as well. So instead of fighting over the book, the two tried to work the book open together. Still, the book didn't budge. "Old man, what do you think the situation is?" Saul asked in frustration. While his curiosity was overflowing, he had no clue how to attempt to open the book. Shaking his head, Immortal Book responded, "I've tried searching for a solution in our master's memoirs, but to no avail. I don't know what to do." From the very beginning, Immortal Book tried to find answers within the memoirs. Having flipped through each book in the library thousands upon thousands of times, he could probably recite any book he wished. It was too simple a task for him at that point. But never did his master mention such a book without a rune. Was it that important that it had to be hidden? It must be some kind of deceptive trick. Master probably doesn't wish for anyone to find this book. If that's the case, there must be a seal on the book somewhere. With only our strength, I'm afraid we can't open it, Immortal Book concluded. While Zen stared at the unmovable book, thinking about how to get it open, he knew that the books on the floor were already more than enough for his cultivation. But no one could deny that the strange book tugged at everyone's curiosity. No matter what kind of cultivation method was held in the book, Zen was determined to see what was inside. Chapter 964, Footprints. Apart from the lack of a rune, the book didn't look particularly special to Zen. It was only a little bit thinner than the others. The cover seemed to be a dark red color as well, slightly darker than that of the others. Upon careful examination, Zen could see a thin layer of energy quietly circulating on the book's surface. "What is this?" Zen asked as he stared at the layer of energy radiating from the cover. But Immortal Book only shook his head and explained, "It's just a layer of dust-repelling spell. Although I clean the library every day, dust can't be avoided. Master used the spell on most of the books." After circling around the book a few times, Saul shook his head in defeat. "I know Master's personality. Under normal circumstances, he wouldn't leave behind these unsolvable puzzles. And even if he did, he wouldn't leave them in the library of all places." "Where is your master now?" Zen asked. If even the puppet their master had created had become immortal, then he must have been an extremely powerful warrior. It made Zen wonder where he had gone. "After Master entered the depths of chaos, he never came back," Saul muttered. The depths of chaos. Suddenly, Zen was reminded of the chaotic storm chronicle. The chaos was seemingly unending. It was unknown how many years it would take to explore. Meanwhile, Immortal Book was still lost in thought. Though he was in charge of the library, he was completely clueless about the book. It was rather humiliating on his part. He had stayed in the library for countless years, after all. After a long moment of pondering, Immortal Book said slowly, "Whatever the case is, the book is here. It must be a cultivation method that can be cultivated." "Cut the garbage," Saul sneered. But Immortal Book shook his head. "Master has collected countless cultivation methods in his lifetime. He has learned them all and is proficient in each." The fact caught Zen's attention in surprise. "You mean that he has already practiced these tens of thousands of cultivation methods?" "Not only that, there are far more than just tens of thousands of cultivation methods in the library. With Master's talent, he can master a single cultivation method in a day. It's too simple for him at this point." The thought left Zen speechless. Such talent was probably too much for him to even comprehend. However, during the last 10,000 years before Master left, one thing troubled him, Immortal Book continued. To that, Zen's eyes slightly flickered. This kind of almighty being must be practically omnipotent. Could anything really bother him? With a nod of his head, Immortal Book explained, "Master has great abilities, so there are few things in the world that could really trouble him. But he has spent these 10,000 years doing a single thing. He wanted to introduce chaos into his body so he could wield it." Introduce chaos into his body to use it? Zen's expression turned even more shocked than it was. A warrior's body was the purest vessel. It was true that it could be used as a sumeru space and contain foreign objects, like manuals and treasures. But the inner world formed within one's belly was still formed from the purest life vitality. It was just like Brianna's inner world, where the small island, the vast sea, the roaring thunder, and all other living beings took form from her life vitality. As for the forceful energy, it was always scattered throughout one's body, from its organs to its muscles and tendons. Life vitality and forceful energy were two different kinds of energies. Even forceful energy couldn't be introduced to one's belly. How could chaos be drawn into the body? Was it even possible? That's right. According to Master's speculation, the chaos is a type of origin energy. The positive and negative energies evolved from it, just as the four seasons were evolved from those positive and negative energies. All sorts of things in the universe come from the chaos, after all. Since the spiritual energy of heaven and earth evolved from it as well, then why couldn't the chaos be considered a kind of life vitality? As Immortal Book explained, Zen remained silent. Such thinking wasn't something he could comprehend so easily. While he understood that there was some truth to the conjecture, how could any living being in the universe ever dare to do such a thing? The chaos was something that existed outside of the universe, after all. Even a Supreme Lord wouldn't be able to leave the universe and enter it. In the memoirs Master left, I discovered some things. He did verify his own method and compiled a cultivation method as well. But this cultivation method seems to have some limitations. He is unable to practice it. I suspect that this cultivation method is recorded in this very book. Given that Immortal Book knew every single other text in the library, this was the only plausible conclusion he could come up with. Even Saul, who was always skeptical of him, nodded in agreement. Perhaps this is the one. Unfortunately, it looks like we have no way of opening it. Zen's gaze lingered on the mysterious book as the curiosity grew in his heart. In truth, Zen didn't lack in cultivation methods by any means. In his life, he never had enough time to completely comprehend all the methods he used, such as the one left behind by Blood Fiend Emperor. And he had only mastered the second move of Stellar Body. Of course, Zen was well aware how lucky he was to have become the owner of the Fairy Palace. One day, he would ascend to the upper world and encounter talents from 100,000 supreme worlds. Some of them could end up his opponents in the future. As an incomplete transcendent divine might, the stellar body was something Zen would focus on cultivating. But an incomplete cultivation method had its own flaws, of course. For instance, Letitia's Sutra of Empyrean Goddess was incomplete. She encountered quite a bottleneck during her cultivation. With that in mind, Zen believed that it was extremely important for him to choose a proper cultivation method this time around. While he still wasn't clear on what kind of cultivation method the book held, he could tell that it was an outstanding one. Undoubtedly, he wanted to take a look, even though whether or not he could cultivate it at all was another story. But the main issue remained: he couldn't open the book. Strength alone might not have been enough, but how about the black star? When that thought came to mind, Zen brought it out, planning to smash the black star against the book's cover. At the sight of his motion, Saul's and Immortal Book's faces turned into those of panic. In an instant, Saul grabbed Zen's hand and yelled, "Don't! Master hates it when his books are destroyed," Immortal Book hurriedly explained. The law of causality within the pickaxe is indeed powerful, but if you want to break the cover, that's just wishful thinking. If you try to destroy this book, it will trigger the siren, you'll be in deep trouble. When he saw the pair's reaction, Zen sighed in defeat and put the pickaxe back in his space ring. At that moment, he felt truly helpless. Forget about cultivating the hidden cultivation method, he couldn't even open the book itself. Suddenly, Aura, who wasn't far behind, spoke up. "This bookshelf seems to have changed." "What? Where?" Saul asked in confusion. When she pointed at her feet, the rest took a look, only to see light footprints at their feet. The footprints looked faint on the pitch-black bookshelf, so no one had noticed until that moment. Footprints. Where did these come from? Saul asked aloud. Once again, Immortal Book's face was riddled with confusion at the strange string of events. "I've cleaned this library countless times, but I've never seen these footprints before." "No wonder you're an idiot." Saul threw another crack at him with a roll of his eyes. "Saul, how big is your master's body?" asked Zen, keeping his eyes fixed on the footprints. "Master has a pretty huge physique. Though he can control it at will, he usually stays about the same height as the bookshelf." The bookshelf was about as tall as a mountain. How could such a giant leave those small footprints? Chapter 965, Difficult Steps. Something was amiss. Their master was enormous in size, so it was impossible for him to leave small footprints behind. He must have left them there on purpose. Why did he leave behind such footprints? Saul asked curiously. What's more, these footprints are exactly the same size as a human's. Maybe he'd already known that this day would come, he added. Just after thousands of books had reacted to Zen, a special cultivation method appeared. And no matter how one looked at it, it didn't seem to have appeared coincidentally at all but was specially arranged. "I think so, too. Our master knows everything in this world, thanks to his great theurgy. He should know what would happen today. I believe our head already knew that one day Zen would enter the library. That was why he made this arrangement. We didn't know what he'd done until today," Immortal Book said in agreement. However, he said those words to comfort himself as well. But on second thought, it was odd. Of course, Zen wouldn't question the power of the fairy palace's owner. Someone like him who had transcended the universe possessed great theurgy, without doubt. However, the old man from the celestial position and Yolanda had already said that he was a man with no destiny, and no one in the universe could tell his fortune. Even if Immortal Mist tried to, it wouldn't be genuine. Thus, it might be because of two things. Either the owner of the fairy palace improved his ability to a certain level, and could even predict what Zen, a man with no destiny, would do, or it just so happened to be a coincidence. Right now, nothing seemed to matter anymore. The most important thing was to open this book. As Zen thought of it, he quickly flew towards the other end of the bookshelf. The faint footprints extended from the bookshelf's center all the way to its end, and directly faced the huge book. Dust scattered as Zen stepped forward and followed the steps on the bookshelf. Never had he expected that just as his feet landed on the footprint, a powerful gravitational force reeled him in. It felt like his feet were welded onto the shelf, and made it hard for him to move a step. How could this be? He said with a frown. He tried to activate the forceful energy within his body and raise his feet. However, he wasn't able to make even the slightest movement. The power that held his feet was so strong that he couldn't even move an inch. When Immortal Book, Saul, and the three girls saw Zen, they all rushed and gathered around him. "Can't you move?" Saul asked. He stared at Zen's feet, which looked quite normal. Zen nodded. "It's all right, I can walk," he said with a smile plastered on his face. He felt confident in his own strength. With gritted teeth, he activated the power of 3,000 dragon scales. Once he was ready, he forcefully lifted both his feet. Alas, he still couldn't move them at all. Why? He sucked in a breath of cold air. He never thought that the gravitational force attached to the footprints was so strong, but his face suddenly twisted in a thoughtful expression. 4,000 dragon scales. 5,000 ones. Even though Zen's strength had been raised to the limit, both of his feet were still motionless. A light flickered in Zen's eyes. He never thought that it would be so hard to follow these footprints, he couldn't even move a single step. Zen had almost reached his limit when he used the power of 5,000 dragon scales. He felt a burning sensation when he poured the power into his feet and forcefully lifted them up. If he pushed a little more, his feet might break. If I can't get my feet out, I may have to spend the rest of my life here. With that thought, Zen attempted to retreat. As he retreated, his feet were easily lifted out of the blue. But because he overexerted himself, he staggered a few steps back and almost fell down. After he steadied himself, he gradually calmed down and looked at the row of footprints. It's exactly our master's usual style. Although I don't know why he made such an arrangement, I guess every one of us has learned that it's difficult to advance but easy to retreat, said Immortal Book. It was difficult to advance but easy to retreat. While that was a true and plain fact, how many people had actually put it into practice? Most people understood this, but during a critical moment, they chose to beat a retreat in the face of difficulties. As Zen thought of it, his eyes glinted slightly. He was filled with resolution and once again, he stepped on the footprints. The three girls did not speak. They were well aware that they should not speak now, but they were still a little worried. On the other hand, Margaret looked at Zen with joy. Zen's serious expression always drew her in, for he looked like the most enchanting creature in her eyes. Zen's feet were once again firmly fixed onto the footprints. Since the owner had set such a path, there was no way he would be completely unable to resolve it. And this time, Zen was fully prepared. He first relaxed his whole body, and then held in a deep breath. Since he couldn't move his feet with the power of 5,000 dragon scales, he would use 6,000 ones. His cultivation had greatly increased, and so was his ability to bear the power of the dragon scales when he had broken through to the life and death realm. However, his body had reached its limit when he used 6,000 dragon scales. Because of the sudden increase in size, more bloody wounds etched themselves on his body. Puff, puff, puff. 3 separate wounds appeared on Zen's chest and his back. The blood shot out like an arrow. Rise. Zen tried to lift a foot. It doesn't work, either. 100 scales. Puff. A 4th wound burst on his skin. Rise again. His feet didn't move at all. 200 scales. Puff. Still, his feet weren't able to move at all. 300 scales. 400. 500. 600. More and more wounds ruptured on his body as he continued to increase the number of dragon scales. Immortal Book stared in a mix of awe and confusion. Where did he get such powerful strength? It has exceeded the limits of what his physical body can handle. Meanwhile, Saul shook his head and looked rather aloof. Beside him, the 3 girls became more and more anxious. Aura looked deeply regretful. If she had known earlier, she wouldn't have warned Zen about the footprints on the ground. But then again, he would have still discovered them sooner or later even if she didn't tell him. 700 scales. Rise. This time, Zen had finally lifted his right foot. Then he took a step forward, and his right foot was now firmly planted on the next footprint in front of him. Once again, he accumulated the power of the dragon scales and raised his left foot. Step forward. The immense force pressed down on all his body's blood vessels, which naturally ruptured them, including the small ones in his eyes. It made him look like a creature with blood-red orbs. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Zen knew that he could have the strongest fighting strength when exerting the power of 5,000 dragon scales. If he raised it to 6,000 dragon scales by force, his body would be near its limit. Therefore, Zen advanced extremely slow. He walked even slower than an ordinary person. It was as if he had the weight of a mountain on his back. 4 steps, 5 steps, 6 steps. With every single step he took, a gash appeared on his body and blood gushed out of it. Blood arrows shot out from the wounds and pierced through his clothes. One of the blood arrows shot towards Aura. Letitia reacted quickly. She waved her hand, and an ice crystal shield blocked the arrow. The blood arrow's power had dented her shield, which made Letitia look at it with fear. How tremendous was the energy that filled Zen's body? Aura reached out her hand and touched the dent on the ice crystal shield. The blood was frozen solid by the cold air when the blood arrow hit the shield. Aura was speechless as her finger touched the cold bloodstain. 7 steps, 8 steps, 9 steps. It was now that Zen had reached his limit. A breath of air escaped his mouth, which was stained with blood from his body. It then became a cloudy red mist. His internal organs couldn't withstand such a powerful force and had gotten injured. Puff, puff. More heavy pants came from Zen as blood seeped heavily from his wounds. He had only taken 9 steps, but the footprints in front of him extended all the way to the other side of the bookshelf. It only took the palace master 2 to 3 steps to walk from one side of the shelf to the other, but it was thousands of steps for Zen. Chapter 966, Pushing His Limits. At this time, Margaret walked over to him and took out a dainty, white, silk handkerchief that she used to wipe the sweat off Zen's brows. A pat here and there was all it took to ruin the pristine silk fabric, staining it with gunk and blood. Margaret smiled as she lightly wiped his face. Come on. She wasn't as worried compared to Letitia and Aura. It wasn't because she didn't care but because she liked seeing Zen struggle every now and then. For Margaret, a man was the most attractive when he struggled through adversity. Zen nodded to Margaret, his hands reaching for his chest to take out some pills. Meanwhile, Letitia was prepared with a milky white pill beside them. This pill was extremely valuable and guaranteed to be effective since it came from Cloud Hall. She handed it over to Zen immediately. Zen took the pill from Letitia's hand and swallowed it. The medicinal pill, coupled with Zen's lightning-fast recovery rate, immediately healed all wounds on his body. Though each bloody gash looked serious, they weren't that deep and in the end, Zen emerged good as new. The only indication that he was ever wounded was the holes left on his clothes from the blood arrows. Zen finally realized that this road was meant to test his limit of strength. Mighty Soul Sea Realm warriors or even formidable Spirit Supreme Realm warriors would undergo the same thing if they set foot on this path. It was only by pushing himself to the limit would Zen be able to advance. Retreating was easy, all he would need to do was turn back and leave. However, that would mean throwing all his hard work down the drain. I'm not afraid of some little test, he murmured firmly. The edges of his vision darkened, tunneling his focus on the several thousand steps ahead of him. The road ahead was difficult to go through, but he didn't flinch a bit. Go. Zen let the power of the dragon scales surge through his body once again. Blood spurted out of him with each step he took. This time, Zen had taken 10 steps. The price he paid for 10 steps was 12 wounds on his body. The moment he stopped, Letitia was already beside him, stuffing another pill into his mouth. This is the ice muscle pill. I've got about 40 along with around 50 rejuvenating pills. I don't know if it's enough since there are at least 3,000 footprints. She mumbled worriedly. Would these elixirs be enough to help Zen walk down to the end of the road? She wondered. Hearing this, Margaret quickly checked her space ring to see what she had. Unfortunately, instead of pills, all that was in there were neatly folded clothes of varying styles and a few unimportant trinkets. No pills were found there. I still have some pills, Aura offered meekly. Letitia scoffed, her eyes flashing dangerously. Your pills wouldn't be of any help. And it was true, Aura's pills could never be compared to Cloud Hall's. The best she had were only of the 5th grade while Letitia's were at the 7th or 8th grade caliber and they were the top elixirs in the central region. One ice muscle pill could probably cover an entire year's expenses for Cloud Sect, that was how valuable and precious Letitia's pills were. It's all the same, I'll be okay, I will get through this. Besides, I still have some pills with me, Zen said, breaking up the awkwardness of the situation before it escalated further. Immortal Book remained silent. Saul shook his head and said, it's a pity that the pill refining room is closed. I can't get any pills for you. The pill refining furnace in the room has been there for countless years. There are still some unfinished pills in the furnace from when Master left. I don't know how they are now after so many years of refining. When Zen heard this, a smile appeared on Zen's face. It didn't necessarily mean that the longer a pill was refined, the better it would be. In fact, there was the danger of a furnace exploding if it was left to work too long. However, the theurgy that the owner of the fairy palace had was beyond anyone's imagination. There was no way that a pill refined by him would be no good. Zen was certain that whatever was inside the pill refining room would benefit him greatly. But that was something for later. Right now, he needed to focus on the difficult path laid out in front of him. Just as Letitia's pill took effect and healed him, Zen took a deep breath and activated his powers once again. This time, he summoned the power of more than 6,000 dragon scales. Then he continued to advance. The path to advancement was bloody, literally. His robe, once pristine white, had now been dyed a deep, blood red from all the wounds he had sustained. The road behind him was also a casualty, being stained red from the blood from his body. A change of clothes was in order. However, after he took another 100 steps, his fresh clothes had once again been drenched in blood. It took Zen 2 hours to reach the middle section of the bookshelf. Immortal Book couldn't help but shake his head. The test set by the master is too cruel. Saul couldn't help but agree. I know it's meant to test his limits, but aren't there too many footprints? 100 or 200 should have been enough. Why are there so many? It would be impossible for an ordinary martial artist to withstand the pain. A warrior's potential was realized under extremely trying situations. One's survival in the path towards the very top depended on his willingness to endure hardship during life and death trials. Now, this was all well and good for Zen, who had limitless potential. The only problem was, each step he took on this path was like one huge, extremely difficult trial that exhausted his strength to the limit. The path had several thousand steps laid out for him. To get through this meant he must have strong willpower. He might have covered half the distance, but the possibility of him giving up was still high. His face was growing paler by the minute. All of Zen's advantages and abilities were put to the test. He had a sacred weapon-like body, the pills provided for him by his wife were all top grade, but the blood he had shed along the way was also too much. His body was heavy and his legs felt like lead. Not even the power of the dragon scales was enough to help him take that one step forward. But he had already gotten so far. He had already accomplished 1,700 steps. Was he really giving up now? He was now halfway through his goal. His body was exhausted and his mind was addled, but all he could think about was how each shallow footprint only brought him closer to the end. The remaining footprints extended all the way to the front of the huge book. Each footprint looked like a fiend, mocking him and causing more suffering to him. He could feel it. He could feel how his body was giving up on him. There was no strength left in him to continue. Zen breathed deeply. He stood still on the spot, back hunched over as he looked at the path in front of him. The sight sent a pang to Letitia's and Aura's hearts. They'd bear the pain for him if they could. It hurt them so much seeing him suffer this way. However, other than encouraging Zen, they didn't know how to help him. The two stood quietly to the side, frozen with the dilemma of not knowing how to help him. Margaret, however, was different. She rushed towards Zen and hugged him. The blood on his body soaked her chest red. She sniffed the air and the bloody smell filled her nostrils. "You smell of blood," she remarked. "What are you doing?" he asked her weakly, leaning on her embrace. Margaret smiled. "I'm just giving you a warm hug to cheer you on." Zen couldn't help but chuckle. "Do you think I'll give up?" Margaret shook her head, her eyes shining with confidence as she looked up at him. "No, how could my husband, a mighty warrior, give up so easily?" It was true that she felt bitter about the grand wedding ceremony Zen held for Letitia back in Cloud Hall. However, Margaret comforted herself with the thought that her wedding ceremony would be 1,000 times grander once she accompanied Zen to the upper world. Any displeasure on her end was hidden with her grand vision for the future. She would invite all the powerful masters in the universe and all her guests would be famous people with great reputations such as Nameless and Apeiron. Moreover, she would invite all the supreme lords to her wedding ceremony. Her wedding ceremony must be 1,000 times, or 10,000 times grander than the one of Zen and Letitia. Margaret had set herself to invite all the supreme lords despite not really knowing what rank they belonged. It wasn't a title she had heard of until she met Elder Apeiron. The creatures of the upper world would no doubt be shocked if they knew Margaret's plans for this grand wedding ceremony. Zen smiled down at her. "Of course I will not give up," he said, patting her head before walking away from her embrace, taking on the path once again. There were no dangers on this path. It was only an arduous test that required him to push himself to the limit at every step. 3,000 footprints meant pushing his limits over 3,000 times. Even a sacred weapon would probably turn to dust under this sort of repeated torture. Chapter 967, Becoming a Disciple. In the martial arts world, undergoing greater risk and exerting greater effort would often lead to greater rewards, and it was this principle that Zen lived by. However, even if, at the end of this path, it was revealed that this grueling test that pushed him to the limit 3,000 times was only an elaborate prank by the owner, he would still accept it. He didn't need any reward, he just wanted this trial to end. He might have been blessed with exceptional luck, but Zen knew he would have to undergo some pretty challenging obstacles every once in a while. This test was proving to be an exceptionally challenging obstacle for him right now, but he could only keep the faith and move forward. Each step was excruciating and it was a struggle to even lift his foot forward. There was no doubt that this might be one of the most dreadful experiences in his life. Zen had considerably slowed down upon crossing the halfway mark of the road. It took him longer to rest and recover for each step as his body took on a toll from all the suffering he was made to endure. It was a good thing that there was no time limit set for this task. A time limit would have truly made it impossible to cross this path. After he had taken 2,000 steps, Zen would have to rest for several hours for each pause. After 2,500 steps, he would have to rest one day and night every 100 steps forward. His 3 ladies faithfully accompanied him every step of the way, alert and always ready to give him aid. He was their husband and they were more than ready to serve him in whatever way they could. As for Saul and Immortal Book, the two of them had existed in this world for far too long. The amount of time it took Zen to traverse this path was nothing but a blink of an eye to them. Zen took 100 steps a day, so 700 steps took him 7 days. It was at the end of the 7 days that Zen was finally able to step onto the very last footprint. He would have breathed a sigh of relief, perhaps even lain down, but he was not given any chance as a bright ray of light suddenly burst out from behind him. This bright light coalesced into a figure that stood at the starting point of the path. This figure followed the footsteps Zen had also taken, but he crossed the distance of over 3,000 steps in an instant, much faster than Zen did. The figure quickly brushed past Zen and walked towards the huge book, reaching out to flip the cover they had initially failed to open. It's opened. Immortal Book squinted at the figure. This could it be the master? Saul also tried to make out a face from the glowing figure. Maybe it is. I can't be too sure. None of them could make out any defining features from the figure. Perhaps what they saw was merely a shadow left behind by the owner. The book opened on the first page, revealing a door. It was only a book, and the door was only a picture, though it looked incredibly lifelike for Zen. The figure, however, reached out his hand and touched the picture. To everyone's surprise, the figure gently pushed the door and opened it. It moved. The picture actually moved. It's so interesting. Margaret laughed. Letitia frowned beside her. She too thought that everything that happened was amazing, magical even, but she disapproved of Margaret's playful attitude towards the situation. Zen had suffered greatly just to open this door, after all. From the opened doorway was a pitch-black space which the figure readily stepped into. Before he fully entered, the figure turned around and pointed at Zen. Me? Zen asked, pointing to himself. The figure nodded in confirmation. Zen did not hesitate and immediately followed the figure to the door. He had suffered a great deal to get this far. The only thing he felt now was curiosity as to what this book and this door hid from them all. I want to go in too. Margaret whined. No, you can't, Immortal Book said, hurriedly stopping her. Letitia was also quick to scold her. Do you want to die? This fairy palace wasn't dangerous, but it was incredibly strange. It was only after suffering and being driven to his breaking point 3,000 times was Zen able to earn the privilege of entering this door. Those unqualified to enter, such as Margaret, might face serious repercussions if they attempted to go inside. Margaret stuck out her tongue. I was just joking, she said playfully. Letitia rolled her eyes at her childishness while Aura tittered on the side. Zen and the shadow both entered through the door and he found himself in a different world. Just as Zen entered, the picture started moving again. The door behind them closed and light that had come from outside of the door immediately vanished, plunging Zen in pitch-black darkness. Just as he was about to feel the onset of early panic, a voice rang out from the darkness. You were able to cross my limit road, which shows your incredibly strong willpower. You are a promising young man. However, you didn't know what was inside the book in the first place. Just what was it that made you hold on so fiercely in reaching the end? The voice stunned Zen for a moment, and it didn't help that the question posed was quite complicated to answer. Well, he said, gathering his thoughts for a second. I just thought the reward will be high considering the difficulty of walking through this road. The voice let out a sound of approval. You're quite frank. I like this straightforward manner of yours. Ha ha ha. He laughed maniacally. Slowly, the darkness receded as a rainbow-colored light broke through the void, forming irregular patterns across the space. The figure that had opened the book earlier reappeared right in front of Zen. The cultivation method I created needs to be practiced before entering the Soul Sea realm. Once the cultivator opens up a soul sea, the embryo of a world will be formed within his body. By then, it will be too late to exchange chaos for life vitality, the figure told him. This greatly explained things. Immortal Book contained a wide range of knowledge and knew the fairy palace owner quite well. He knew how the owner spent a lot of time creating a cultivation method that he himself could never use. The reason why he wasn't able to use it had been unknown to Immortal Book, until now. It seemed the prerequisite for learning such a method involved not having opened up a world within a warrior's body. Warriors at the life and death realm liquefied their life vitality in their cinnabar field, and they could form a soul sea after they entered the soul sea realm. Zen's life vitality had already started to liquefy way back when he was still at the virtual tribulation realm, and it had actually started to solidify after he broke through to the life and death realm. However, he would still need to achieve the soul sea realm to fully form a world within his body. I must warn you, the cultivation method I created is only theory through deduction. It is a mere embryo, and the only way to cultivate it to the later stages is up to you. You will have to find the path yourself, and it is highly possible that the cultivation method will lead to a dead end and ruin you. However, it is also possible for you to open up a new path. Do you dare practice it? He asked Zen. Judging from his words, the cultivation method had only been deduced based on the Creator's own vast and profound knowledge. It hadn't yet been applied nor adopted by a living person yet. The central region and eastern region both had countless cultivation methods, some were tried and true, others a bit more obscure. This one, the one being proposed by the fairy palace owner, could not even be considered a full-fledged method, it was just a mere concept. For example, someone in the central region proposed the idea of using stars to refine body. This proposal might be correct since Zen himself had been able to activate the power of the stars through the cultivation of stellar body. So it might work if he used the power of the stars to refine his body. The concept was possible, but merely proposing it was not the same as actually doing it in practice. The presenter of the concept might not necessarily fully compile all the processes and practices that came with his proposal. In short, all he really presented was the idea of the method. Theory and praxis were different. And the difference could be too enormous that what came out of theory might be completely irrelevant from what had been originally proposed. But of course, a mere warrior from the central region was different from the fairy palace owner whose theurgy had already surpassed the range of the world and possibly even the heavens. So the concept that he deduced based on his knowledge would naturally be more reliable. There was incredible confidence coming from him in proposing this concept. Zen nodded his head. Yes, I do. He answered with no hesitations. The figure smiled at his ready answer. Very well then, kneel down. Zen couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. Kneel. The figure laughed at his reaction. Why? You don't want to. You want to practice my cultivation method, but you're unwilling to become my disciple. Become this person's disciple. Truth be told, ever since he embarked on the road to martial arts, Zen had never truly had a master. Aura was his master, but not in the traditional sense. Letitia, meanwhile, was the leader of Cloud Hall, so he was more or less her subordinate. He did not really have anyone he could formally acknowledge as his master. He never would have expected that he would get one after suffering 3,000 times and entering a door inside a mysterious book. The amount of things currently happening overwhelmed him a bit, so Zen was quite hesitant. Ha ha ha, I also did not expect that I will one day have a disciple. You seem hesitant to make me your master. Don't tell me you want me to beg you. Chapter 968, The Roaring Token. At this, Zen no longer hesitated. He respectfully went down on his knees and bowed to the figure. He had earlier hesitated because he suddenly had to acknowledge someone as his master. And since he had accepted the owner's legacy, he had to acknowledge him as his master. True men wouldn't go down on their knees, and Zen was no exception. But now that he had chosen to be the owner's disciple, he did what he was supposed to do and paid his respects according to the rules. The owner was an extremely detached man who didn't regard the ceremony of taking a disciple as important. When Zen bowed before the owner, an invisible force stopped him and helped him up. It's all right, the owner said, nodding. We martial artists don't attach much importance to worldly rules. Since you are willing to take me as your master, I will pass on the cultivation method in this book to you. Do you know why I set such a path for this book? I have no idea, Zen said, shaking his head. The owner continued, I had spent tens of thousands of years calculating countless number of times before managing to create a brand new path. I do not know what lies at the end of this path, but the cultivation method begins with replacing life vitality with chaotic energy. For this, you have to forcefully shatter your cinnabar field and introduce chaos into your body. Only those with great perseverance can bear the pain in this course. You relied on your willpower to walk down the path outside, but I still want to remind you that the pain of replacing life vitality with chaotic energy is far beyond what you can imagine. Do you understand? Zen nodded, and said cautiously, yes, I do. The owner smiled at this. It's easy to say yes now. You'll only know the pain later. He looked Zen up and down and said, it's strange. There seems to be primordial energy in your body. And you used it to refine your body once before, right? Zen nodded. The owner seemed to know all the secrets of his body. Your body is a little strange, the owner repeated, but didn't go on about the secrets of Zen's body. Body refinement is also very painful, but the pain brought by replacing life vitality with chaotic energy is probably thousands of times greater than that brought by body refinement. Pain was something that could not be quantified. Some people found it unbearable while others had the strength to bear it. But the owner knew that there was an enormous difference and was very clear about it. He hadn't just said that to frighten Zen. I've been fully prepared for this since I acknowledged you as my master, Zen said. Good, the owner said, giving Zen an approving look. Since you managed to endure that path, you're worthy of confirmation. Also a sliver of chaotic energy for you. Saying this, he pointed off into distance, a gray fog sweeping out from deep within the space. So this is chaotic energy? Zen raised his eyebrows as he stared at the dusky fog. The chaotic energy circled in the air once and then shot towards Zen, entering his cinnabar field through his abdomen. From beginning to end, Zen hadn't felt anything unusual. When the fog entered his cinnabar field, he felt a slight pain in his abdomen, as if he was being stuck by needles. I've already planted a strand of chaotic energy for you, the owner said. Zen tried circulating his life vitality and didn't feel anything out of ordinary or any unbearable pain. He was puzzled, since he had thought that he was going to die of the pain. The owner smiled at Zen's expression and said, chaotic energy has only been planted into your cinnabar field. I will pass on a cultivation method to you to cultivate it. You will understand when that time comes. The world spun as mysterious formulas of cultivation method poured into Zen's mind. And then, the owner looked surprised. The 9 dragons were being suppressed by the divine flame cauldron. My disciple's luck isn't bad, he thought emphatically. Given his high level of theurgy, he had never accepted disciples easily. He had only accepted 2 disciples so far. And right now, despite his realization, he did not tell Zen that he had good luck. As Zen's master, he would not interfere with that. But as he thought about the origins of the divine flame cauldron, he couldn't help but remind Zen, if you are to ascend to the upper world one day, you can't tell anyone anything about the divine flame cauldron that's in your mind. Before you grow to be strong, you must hide it and treat it as your greatest secret. Divine flame cauldron. Zen knew that he couldn't have secrets from his master. But he was still amazed when his master mentioned the name of the mysterious furnace. He knew that the mysterious furnace was something extraordinary, but he didn't know its name. The cyan dragon was unwilling to tell him about its origin and he could hardly trace it to its source. And now, he had finally learned its name from his master. His master, however, seemed to have no intention of talking more about the divine flame cauldron. He said, I've left a projection in this book. I've accepted you as my disciple today, but I don't have any gift for you. These things may be useful for you one day. Saying this, he gently waved his hand and a few shiny treasures flew towards Zen. Zen held the golden lights as he thanked his master. There were a few sparkling fragments, within which were sealed a few treasures. All right, I've been away for too long. This soul projection can only exist for a short period of time. Since I've already planted some chaotic energy within you and imparted a cultivation method to you, you have to cultivate hard. Maybe one day, I will be able to come back from that endless foreign land. And then, I will check on your strength, my cheap disciple. His voice became softer and his figure became fainter by the minute. How do I use these things? Zen asked, looking at the fragments in his hand. Each of these was tiny, smaller than any of Zen's fingers. Just crush them. The figure became fainter and fainter, and his voice was almost inaudible now. Crush them. Zen looked at the place where his master had completely disappeared and said dubiously, a cheap disciple. What does that mean? The cyan dragon's voice sounded. He has you as his disciple. Of course it's cheap for him. Cyan dragon hadn't dared to speak all this while, but now that Zen's master had discovered the divine flame cauldron, he knew that he must also have discovered the 9 dragons. He simply had avoided pointing it out. So the cyan dragon hadn't shown up of his own accord. You mean he has taken advantage of me? It's funny, Zen said, amused, finding it all very interesting. He had entered the fairy palace and obtained a cultivation method, and now, had gained so many gifts. No matter how he looked at it, he had taken advantage of his master. The cyan dragon chuckled and said, it's a good thing to take you as a disciple, as you have got a Mahayana lotus flower. It was obvious that the cyan dragon's thinking was going on a completely different path from Zen's. Zen didn't press the issue because at that moment, a door had appeared behind him. He knew that the door on the painting had opened again. And then, he flew out, still looking wonderingly at the shiny fragments in his hands. As he flew, he followed his master's instructions and crushed one of the fragments. The texture of the fragment was tough and brittle, and with a gentle pinch, it shattered into pieces. A palm-sized sculpture in the shape of a bear with its mouth wide open emerged. What is this? Zen examined the sculpture, confused and curious. Even the knowledgeable cyan dragon stared at the palm-sized sculpture thoughtfully. But Zen had already stepped into the huge book and walked out of the painting. Immortal Book saw the sculpture in Zen's hand and laughed. Master did leave a legacy in the book, but I hadn't expected him to leave the roaring token for you. The roaring token, the cyan dragon cried out in Zen's mind as he heard this. He had turned pale with fright. Chapter 969, The Death Chain. What was the roaring token? Zen stared at Immortal Book in bewilderment. Immortal Book shook his head, preparing to showcase his knowledge. But Saul intervened and said, this roaring token is an old object that was used by the master in the past. If one uses the roaring token to shout out something, his voice can be heard throughout the entire universe. The roaring token is very common in the universe, but our master's roaring token is special. It can be used countless times. Countless times. The cyan dragon roared once again. How could there be such a darn thing? The red dragon roared after being uncommunicative all this while. The two genuine dragons were inexplicably excited. Zen was dizzy with all the roaring going on in his head. He had learned from Saul that the roaring token was just a tool to shout out words. Moreover, Saul had introduced the roaring token rather indifferently, which showed that it was perhaps not something important. But why were the two genuine dragons so excited? Why? Zen asked the cyan dragon, confused. The cyan dragon let out a long sigh and then said incredulously, I know that the owner of this fairy palace is a true god who surpasses the natural law, but I didn't expect him to actually have such a treasure. What do you mean? Can you explain more clearly? The cyan dragon wasn't helping relieve Zen's confusion. This token was just a tool for shouting, so why did the cyan dragon marvel so much at it? The cyan dragon hadn't been this excited when Zen had obtained the black star. Could it be that the roaring token was better than the supreme divine weapon? The cyan dragon said, 100,000 supreme worlds are too vast and it is extremely inconvenient to communicate with others in the universe. A single roaring token can spread your voice throughout the entire universe. Oh, Saul had just talked about what the roaring token did and the cyan dragon was merely repeating it all. Was spreading the voice all over the universe that important? Seeing Zen's dubious expression, the cyan dragon smiled and said, once you fly into the upper world, you'll have the right to speak if your voice can spread throughout the universe. Which is why every race and every force demand that the roaring token be used an unlimited number of times. The cyan dragon was trying his best to explain the roaring token to Zen. Zen knew that the upper world was composed of 100,000 supreme worlds, but he didn't have a clear understanding of the scope of these worlds. The supreme world was too large, which made gathering and making use of its forces extremely difficult. Besides, as the three great forces of the human race occupied nearly 10,000 supreme worlds, a wide range, communication became a big problem. The roaring token could help warriors' voices spread through the universe to let others hear them easily. Why did this token's name contain the word, roaring? It had something to do with a unique legendary beast in the universe called Roaring Tapir. The roaring tapir wasn't the strongest among the legendary beasts, but it developed an innate theurgy as it attained adulthood. This theurgy had a type of law of causality, which was why the roaring tapir's roar could spread throughout the entire universe. Some supreme lords had discovered the theurgy of the roaring tapir, caught, and killed it. They then took away its throat and had their craftsmen create the roaring token with its throat. The roaring token allowed the supreme lords to spread their voice throughout the universe. From then on, legendary beasts like the roaring tapir faced extremely tragic fates. Back then, a lot of roaring tokens existed in the universe, even some world lords owning a large number of them. And a number of unfamiliar voices would keep ringing in one's ears. The most ridiculous event was when two races that were considered as old enemies roared at each other and called each other names through the roaring tokens even though they were separated by hundreds of supreme worlds. That war of cursing lasted for months, and countless creatures in the universe suffered. So some supreme lords had no choice but to use the roaring tokens to warn the two races against quarreling. If these two races continued to shout abuse, then they would have to be very careful of their own territories. But there wasn't much use in warning someone. If someone with a high status was to randomly use the roaring token and got punished by the supreme lords, he could just ask an insignificant subordinate to be the scapegoat. On the other hand, if some nameless warriors used the roaring tokens to make their voices heard throughout the entire universe, it was impossible for others to find the sources or figure out who were using the roaring tokens since no one knew their identities. The universe didn't contain a countless number of roaring tapirs. But the number of roaring tapirs wasn't small either. A lot of races needed the roaring tokes. It could be said that whoever had the most number of roaring tokens would be able to command a certain right to speak. One roaring tapir's throat could only be used to make one roaring token. Even the best craftsman could, at the maximum, only create 2 tokens with one roaring tapir's throat. And so, the number of roaring tapirs began to rapidly decrease. It had ended up becoming an extremely rare species. Since its numbers dwindled, the roaring tapir's value increased exponentially to the point where ordinary world lords could no longer afford the roaring tokens. Because of this, an undisturbed, quiet environment followed hundreds of years of chaos in the universe, much to everyone's relief. There were still quite a few roaring tokens in the universe, thanks to some large forces that had started raising the roaring tapirs. But their growth was slow and the value of the roaring tokens was still very high. In the 100,000 supreme worlds, there were a few world lords who had 1 or 2 roaring tokens. But they weren't willing to use them recklessly. The supreme lords had more roaring tokens, but they were also against casually using them. Zen understood the roaring token better once the cyan dragon had introduced it to him. He hadn't thought that a tool for shouting words across the universe would be so important. However, once he had thought about it, he understood the functioning of the roaring token better. To put it bluntly, this thing could shout out to the entire universe any number of times. For example, if there ever was a war between humans and ogres, and both sides were fighting in thousands of supreme worlds, it would be extremely inconvenient to communicate with each other. By the time reinforcements got news of fierce battles taking place in obscure places of a supreme world, the battles would have already ended. But if they used the roaring token to communicate with their members, news would reach their reinforcements in a short time. Besides, in a battle between 2 races, if one side had a lot of roaring tokens, they would make use of them to abuse and defame the other side, and even fabricate fake intelligence, which would be a huge blow to the morale of the enemy. If one side had too few of the roaring tokens, or none at all, then members could do nothing but stare. Zen laughed as he looked at the roaring token in his hand. It was indeed a good thing. Zen did not forget that he still had one more important goal, and that was to find his sister. Although he felt that Yan was safe, he couldn't accept the fact that she had been taken away by someone he did not know. If he were to fly into the upper world in the future, Zen might have to use this roaring token to shout to Yan to see if she could reply. I just can't figure out how the owner of the fairy palace created a roaring token that can be used for unlimited times. The cyan dragon said disbelievingly, still in shock. I don't care. Zen couldn't be bothered to think about this, as long as it was useful. Once he had put the roaring token into his space ring, Zen crushed the second fragment. As he did so, a shining chain appeared within the fragment. Zen pulled the chain out and said, disappointment lacing his voice, this. What is this? In the beginning, he had thought that his master's gift would most likely be a supreme divine weapon. And he had guessed that his master might give him at least a divine weapon. But now, as he crushed the fragments, he was confused as to why he was getting such strange things. When Saul saw the chain, he smiled and said, this is the death chain. The death chain, what's the use of it? Zen asked. When you first entered the fairy palace, did you trigger a desperate melee in the pavilion? Saul asked his way of an answer. Zen nodded. He still remembered that desperate melee vividly. Everyone had been connected to each other by a special energy and fought a life and death battle as only one could survive in the end. So that's it. The death chain can lock you and your opponent together, and it would open only after the battle is over and one of the fighters is killed. Even if a Supreme Lord is locked up with you, he won't be able to escape if he can't kill you. Chapter 970, The Extreme Pain. Zen wasn't stupid to lock himself in with a Supreme Lord. But thanks to Saul's explanation, Zen understood that the death chain would be of great use. He could lock an opponent whose strength was on par with his so that he wouldn't be able to escape. Zen felt that the death chain was much more practical when compared to the roaring token. The decision was in his hands and he could decide whether or not he would use it. Zen stuffed the death chain into his space ring, in no hurry to crush the remaining pieces. But he was anxious to figure out the cultivation method his master had just passed down to him. His master, who had created and named the cultivation method, had poured it into Zen's mind. It was called the Primal Chaos Technique. The name was rather simple. Zen suspected that his master was just too lazy to think of a suitable name. But the strength of warriors did not depend on their names. Likewise, the strength of a cultivation method was not something that could be determined by its name either. Zen was a little worried when it came to cultivating this method. After all, his master had only deduced it, and he himself had never practiced it. But if a cultivation method could be obtained and cultivated by many people, it wouldn't be valuable enough and Zen wouldn't take a fancy to it. This cultivation method was different, no one had cultivated it before. If Zen started on this path, it would be one that no one had ever walked before. Who knew what he would find at the end? Zen followed the method recorded in the manual and slowly condensed the life vitality in his belly. The wisp of chaotic energy that had disappeared, jumped back to life and word in his belly. It was at this moment that he finally understood what pain was. Zen paled the instant the pain began shooting through his body. He was rooted to the spot, unable to move. Even his instinct to howl had disappeared. "What's wrong?" Letitia asked nervously. When the three women saw that Zen seemed to have obtained some sort of inheritance after entering the book, they had become happy. But they became worried at the way he had paled so suddenly. The pain originated from his cinnabar field, as if something was grinding his belly without stop. The cinnabar field was the most sensitive yet most important part of a warrior. The pain spread and stimulated every nerve in Zen's body. Margaret rushed forward and asked nervously, "Zen, are you feeling all right?" Zen barely had the time to answer before his eyes rolled back and he fainted. He hoped that he would remain unconscious because he knew that if he woke up, it would be nothing less than perdition's torment for him. The three women surrounded Zen, anxious at his state. "Zen, what's wrong with you? Why did he pass out?" They all started to cry. Immortal Book glanced at Zen before saying, "Don't worry. He isn't hurt, it's just too painful." Zen stirred after a while, but the pain was like a shadow that followed him into consciousness. He let out a howl as his eyes rolled back and he fainted again. It wasn't that Zen's willpower was lacking, it was just that the pain had already far surpassed the limit that a human could endure. A warrior's cinnabar field was usually filled with pure life vitality. So how could it tolerate a foreign object? Due to the excruciating pain, Zen's body had activated its self-protection mechanism, causing him to faint. The three women were speechless and worried for Zen. They had no idea what was happening to him, or why he was suffering so much. After a long time, Zen woke up once again. He was still unable to speak, but the duration for which he woke up this time was much longer than the second time he had regained consciousness. The second time, he had only lasted 3 seconds, and the third time around, he had endured about 15 seconds before fainting again. When he woke up the fourth time, Zen held on for about a minute, wailing and groaning as he did so. The fifth time, he persevered for about 2 minutes. The sixth time, about 3 minutes. The seventh time, about 5 minutes. The eighth time, Zen repeatedly fainted and woke up. He was not used to this kind of pain. It was not something that humans could adapt to. It was just that his willpower to endure it was rapidly increasing. After the 10th time, his lips trembled, and he finally spoke. "We will be taking our leave first. Let's talk about it after we return to the central region." Then, he fainted once again. Zen had the token of mountain, which meant that he could return to the fairy palace any time he wanted. But he didn't have much time to think right now. Moreover, it would be very difficult to focus under extreme pain. He would have to wait until he returned to the central region. Since Zen had said so, the three women would naturally bring him back to the central region. This time, Letitia gently clapped her hands and took out the flood dragon puppet that she and Zen had obtained together. Zen woke up once again. After bidding farewell to Saul and Immortal Book, he rode the flood dragon puppet with the three women and left the fairy palace. They returned to the eastern region and exited the cloudy mountain, flying into the sky. The valley in the cloudy mountain was called Dragon Valley because there were rumors that a dragon lived in there. Many people in G County watched as the flood dragon puppet left the cloudy mountain. They were now convinced that there was indeed a dragon in the mountain. It had to be worshipped since it was a dragon's nest. They believed that if anyone provoked the dragon, it would most probably punish all living beings. Therefore, a few large clans in G County had issued a prohibition, preventing anyone from approaching the cloudy mountain. As they nestled within the body of the flood dragon puppet, Zen fainted and recovered continuously. He remained unconscious for a longer period of time than he stayed awake. He would be awake for 5 to 10 minutes, but would be unconscious for several hours. It took Letitia a few days to bring the flood dragon puppet back to the Cloud Hall. She instructed people to prepare a private residence for Aura, after which she stayed with Zen to take care of him. 3 months had passed in the blink of an eye. These 3 months saw Zen constantly passing out and waking up. This would be sheer torture to anyone, and Zen was no exception. This pain had persisted for too long, and had even caused Zen's mentality to change. He was extremely regretful. If he had known that it would be so painful, he wouldn't have practiced this cultivation method no matter what. It was not that Zen's willpower was weak. He was not almighty. Even if his warrior spirit and willpower were stronger than those of ordinary warriors, this kind of pain was not something that any living being could endure. And Zen couldn't bear it either. Or maybe he could if he were a rock. How could the three women even smile when they saw the pain that Zen was in? Letitia fiercely guarded the ice palace. She let Saint Morphans take care of other matters that cropped up in the Cloud Hall. As time went by, the time that Zen remained conscious became longer and longer. This kind of pain did not numb the body. Every time a wave of pain rippled through him, it made him feel like his head was about to explode. He would rather not wake up than endure this. One day, Zen slowly came to consciousness, and the moment he woke up, he knew that he would have to spend a few more hours in torment. But he could hear a melodious sound wafting in. Margaret was caressing the strings of her zither, just outside the ice palace. The music was so beautiful that it made Zen feel at ease. Even though the music could not suppress the pain, Zen still felt slightly better. He struggled to get up, while Letitia, who had been waiting by his side for a countless number of days, immediately went up to support him. "Be careful," she said softly. But as he rose, Zen suddenly discovered that the pain in his cinnabar field had disappeared. The torment that had lasted for almost half a year had suddenly disappeared. Chapter 971, The Chaotic Energy. Of all human sensations, pain demands the most tolerance. The fact that Zen was able to endure such intense torture for a long time without losing his mind was testament enough to the strength of his will. When all the pain left his body, relief flooded his senses. Half a year had passed, and he had overcome the torture. Margaret and Letitia did not know that the pain had gone. As Zen straightened himself slowly, Margaret halted playing the zither while Letitia asked him softly, her voice expressing her deep concern, "Zen, are you all right?" A mischievous thought came to his mind as he looked at the two women's faces. Deciding to play a trick, he shook his head slightly and affected an air of being in pain. I'm afraid I can't make it this time," he coughed out. Shadows immediately fell upon Letitia's and Margaret's faces at his words. Not far away, Aura, who had been praying for Zen, ran over to him in haste and held his hand. The three women hovered over him in somber silence. Suddenly, Zen's arms shot out and pulled the three of them into his embrace. Margaret and Aura screamed. Surprised gasps tickled his ears as he flew up into the sky and burst into laughter. He took them and jumped out of the ice palace's roof with them in his embrace. Their worries fled as they floated in the air. Aura's eyes were bright as she marveled at him. Zen's strong arms were wrapped around her securely, and she felt the warmth of his skin on her own. Margaret laughed as she pummeled his chest, playfully castigating him for playing such a dirty trick. It was only Letitia who was different. Her eyes were as sharp as daggers as she glared at him, anger written all over her face. The next moment, a white, cold mist rose up in the air. "Hey, it's freezing," Margaret complained, her mood going sour at Letitia's actions. The cold draft touched them with its icy fingers and the other two women shivered. Letitia only let out a defiant humph and slipped out from Zen's arms, returning to the ice palace. The three women had been at peace for the past few months. It had been a standstill among them when Zed was unconscious, but now that he had recovered, the old discord had come to life once more. Jealousy was an emotion that could only be suppressed at most, but never dispelled or forgotten. Zen could only smile wryly before he let go of Margaret and Aura. He then followed Letitia and entered the ice palace, wanting to soothe her. That night, after he had bathed and changed his clothes, he sat alone on a platform in Cloud Hall. Letitia had calmed down after some time of coaxing, and he had some time in his hands. For the past months, he had not been able to check on himself in the midst of the extreme pain. His first instinct was to scrutinize the changes in his body. Zen crossed his legs, adapting a posture for meditation and focusing his energy on his belly. A shocked expression appeared on his face as he entered into a state of introspection. Before, his body had been filled with liquefied life energy. It had been a unique kind, viscous and malleable. But now, there was not even a single drop. None of his previous life vitality was present. Instead, he found the chaotic energy which looked dusky in its place. "Is it done? Has the chaotic energy replaced my life vitality?" Zen muttered. The cyan dragon said in his mind, "Chaotic energy. Your master has indeed surpassed the natural law. The chaotic energy inside you is proof of that. Warriors use their own life vitality to cultivate, that is the law of nature. Even supreme lords have no power over this. But your master was able to create such a unique cultivation method, replacing the life vitality with chaotic energy. This is truly an amazing feat. The Cyan dragon couldn't help but shake his head as he spoke. Zen's forehead furrowed in confusion. But you said it yourself. Warriors use their life vitality to cultivate. The life vitality will be liquefied when a warrior reaches the life and death realm. Then a deep sea of life vitality will be opened up in his body when he reaches the soul sea realm. When he reaches the spirit supreme realm, the life vitality will be solidified and creatures will be created within the world in his body. But now, I no longer have any life vitality. So how am I supposed to progress? He asked. The Cyan dragon shook his head grimly. Such a thing has never happened in my life. It is beyond me. Therefore, I cannot possibly answer you. There was no guarantee that Zen's master, the creator of this cultivation method, would be able to answer his question. It was a newly carved path in the world of warriors, and there was no one who could possibly offer him guidance. Sensing Zen's loss, the Cyan dragon continued, however, there is one thing I can say. This chaotic energy is something that exists outside of the universe. All creatures had been born from primal chaos. It is an extremely powerful but equally dangerous existence for all creatures. And yet, you have it inside your body, which is a very strange occurrence. Even I am not sure whether the chaotic energy can really replace life vitality. Warriors relied primarily on their life vitality for cultivation. It was an indispensable element, as an arrow is to a bow. However, Zen's life vitality had completely disappeared. There was nothing but the chaotic energy inside him. Did this mean that the known cultivation methods were now completely unsuitable for him? As he listened to the Cyan dragon, Zen's heart skipped a beat. What he said made perfect sense. Zen started to manipulate his belly the usual way, using his meridians to extract life vitality from his body. However, under this kind of extraction, the chaotic energy was drawn out instead of the life vitality. As the chaotic energy followed his meridians, he felt a sudden and intense pain. Again, Zen clenched his teeth as he thought of the implications. For half a year, he had endured the unthinkable pain, and now it was as if the pain had only shifted its position and began to target his meridians next. To his relief, the overwhelming sensation only lasted for a few brief moments before it subsided. Then, Zen began to test the newfound chaotic energy. With a gentle wave of his hand, a streak of vigorous chaotic energy gushed out from his palm. The fire law. Zen was unfamiliar with any fire system cultivation method, but he had no problem activating the fire law. Boom. At first, there had only been complete silence in the darkness. It was deep in the night, and people in Cloudy City had already fallen into a deep slumber. In the midst of the quiet, a violent explosion suddenly rang in the air, wrenching people away from the arms of sleep. At the same time, they looked outside their windows with stupefied expressions. It was the middle of the night, and dawn was still far off, so where did all the light come from? A huge sun-like flare was in the sky, lighting up the surroundings with a brilliance that was akin to sunlight. All Zen did was casually throw out a fireball based on the first layer of the fire law. He had never imagined that it would have that much power. The fireball spread out and was eventually covered by the circular light of water. The light reflected and took the form of the sun. What unbelievable power! Zen marveled at the sight. He had been right to direct the fireball towards the sky. The lingering flames had ignited quite a number of parts of the cloud hall, but left everyone unharmed. After the fireball exploded, the light remained for some more moments before disappearing. The cloud hall was awake, with disciples running around in haste to put out the fire. Zen gazed into the sky for some time even after all the light had disappeared. The Cyan dragon's words about primal chaos lingered in his mind. Other warriors trained their life vitality, which was a kind of energy created and bound by nature. What Zen possessed now was chaotic energy, created by the primal chaos. Just now, he had only used the chaotic energy to activate the fire law. How much more powerful would it be if he used the methods in the manual that his master had created? As Zen became more and more familiar with the chaotic energy inside him, his future achievement might exceed his master's expectations. His master had created the primal chaos technique, but he had not practiced it himself. At present, chaotic energy had completely replaced the life vitality within Zen's body. With this, he would be able to create his own cultivation method far beyond his master's limits. Zen's chest beat wildly in anticipation. The future held endless possibilities. No one had walked this path before, and it would be incredibly difficult for Zen to learn on his own. But he believed that once he completed his journey, a new era would open up by his own hands. Chapter 972. the way to collect the magnetic sacred mountain. A warrior paved his cultivation path towards a unique goal. Some saw it as a road towards unlimited power and resources. Some saw it as a stepping stone to achieve recognition. Some saw it as an easy way to get beautiful women. Zen, on the other hand, was obsessed with the practice of cultivation itself. His main motivation was not gold, power, or glory but the sheer interest he had for it. In the past, Zen had created his very own sword move, the no move. This time, he practiced a cultivation method that had been practiced by no one before. It was like walking a new, undiscovered path. He knew it was bound to be difficult, but he had faith that it would lead to a beautiful place. The large fireball greatly alarmed the warriors of Cloud Hall, but they quickly calmed down when they heard that it was only Zen cultivating. No one would dare argue nor admonish him. Zen, first and foremost, was a disciple of Cloud Hall's elite house. Moreover, he was now also the #1 warrior in Central Region and the husband of Cloud Hall's leader. Nobody could really consider him as a mere disciple anymore. Now that he had finished his goal of returning to the Eastern Region and taking Aura back, Zen could now rest and cultivate in peace here in Cloud Hall. Aside from that, he was also blessed to be graced with the company of 3 beauties. It wasn't really as peaceful as he would have hoped since there was still a bit of conflict among them. None really entertained the notion of having to share a husband. Still, their dynamic worked. Margaret was relatively carefree and spent most of her time teasing the ancestral dragon or idling by Zen's side. She should have, in theory, already made a breakthrough given the time and ample resources the Cloud Hall provided. Her purple power body also gave her an innate advantage but the young woman just didn't take cultivation that seriously. Margaret remained stuck at the early stage of the internal elixir realm and did not seem to have any intention of improving herself, at least that was what Zen thought. He actually had some doubts regarding this carefree lady of his. He hadn't forgotten that old man from the celestial position race. Zen had tried to use the memories of the world's will to find out what that old man and Margaret talked about back then, but he came up with nothing. He figured that it might be because the old man was technically an outsider from this great world so he might not necessarily be able to find out any information about him. Margaret, though, was born in the Central Region which made Zen suspicious. The old man might have done something to shield their conversation, hiding them from the memories of the world's will. The only thing Zen was able to discover was Margaret's mysterious departure from the Cloud Hall that night. She most probably entered the purple power world but whatever transpired in there was unknown to him. He truly did not intend to pry. He was just worried since Margaret had the tendency to be stupid sometimes. It was difficult for Zen to ask her about it directly and he didn't have any idea how to make her open up to him since she had long been on guard around him. It was an issue he was still trying to work around with. Aura and Letitia, on the other hand, remained diligent with their cultivation. Letitia was a somewhat busy woman, spending her days in cultivation while also dealing with the Cloud Hall's affairs. Margaret's constant presence around Zen irked her, but she really couldn't do anything about it since the young woman was not a disciple of the Cloud Hall. The one that surprised Zen the most was Aura. She had been very hard-working all this time. The moment she arrived at the Cloud Hall, Aura quickly immersed herself in cultivating the method she had chosen within the fairy palace. During the half-year Zen spent being ravaged by chaotic energy, Aura was making leaps and bounds in her cultivation. Her cultivation was now at the ultimate level of the illuminating soul realm, on par with Margaret. Zen had also considerably improved as time went on. He had recently experienced his second life and death tribulation, but it had not been difficult since he was able to redirect the attacks to the magnetic sacred mountain. However, he still remained on guard against the black eye that was demon bent on destroying him. Dealing with such a formidable enemy was incredibly serious. Last time, Zen was lucky and had managed to redirect the Black Eye's strike to the Great World's mountains causing the destruction of around 5 million mountains. Such a devastating outcome came about from a mere, casual attack from a mighty being. Zen was certain that if the Black Eye got serious, he was sure to die. Even though he had fused with the will of the Great World and even if he would never die so long as the Great World existed, Zen knew it would be a piece of cake for the Black Eye to destroy everything. Fortunately, the Black Eye did not appear during his life and death tribulation so he was able to breathe a sigh of relief. The pill that the old man from the celestial position race gave him also helped since he noticed his cultivation rise at a faster rate ever since he took it. It was after another half-year that his third life and death tribulation descended upon him once again. A lot of interesting things took place during this time. More and more talents appeared while those from Zen's generation had finally settled and found their calling. Rocher, only in his early 20s, had become the youngest elder in the Cloud Hall. His talent had reached terrifying new heights with his continued comprehension of the heavenly sword. Letitia had remarked to Zen that Rocher was in the running as the next leader of the Cloud Hall, a position she would be vacating once Zen and she ascended to the upper world. There were, of course, many more talents in the Cloud Hall, and Rocher was sure to have a lot of competition in store for him if he ever wished to vie for the position. Still, Letitia believed that he was a strong, worthy contender. Zen's rise to power also signaled the advent of the prosperity of Central Region's warriors. The 4 divine kingdoms remained superior, of course, but it could not be denied that Central Region had come a long way from their initial state. The Bloodwood Cliff, Mysterious Luna Hall, Black Mountain Sect. The Ethereal Spirit Sect had just recently been rebuilt and was now focusing on nurturing their pool of warriors. It was highly likely that Central Region's divine-level talents would go on to become Soul Sea Realm Masters in the future. Today, Zen took out the token of Mountain and held it in his hand. He had never used it, nor did he know the principle behind it. However, the moment he activated the token, the information flooded through his mind and he suddenly was able to understand how it worked. With this sudden influx of information, the image of the fairy palace appeared right in front of him. It was exactly the same as the one in Cloudy Mountain but relatively smaller in size. Zen quickly stepped into this mini fairy palace and was suddenly transported inside. Despite appearing to him as a smaller version, the place he had stepped into was incomparably grand and huge. Of course, it was all an illusion shown to him by the token. So this is how it is supposed to be used, he remarked to himself. If he ever found himself in a pinch, he could take out the token and hide himself in this palace. Since he was already here, Zen made it a point to head towards the library. The library was an immense fountain of knowledge from which he could reap endless benefits. Instead of searching for cultivation methods, Zen looked for and gathered information regarding weapon refining and divine texture writing. Immortal book whispered recommendations to his ear all throughout, but Zen still managed to browse a few books he chose himself. In one of these books, he had unexpectedly managed to obtain some information regarding the magnetic sacred mountain. According to the source, the magnetic sacred mountain could actually be collected. It contained the power of 5 elements: metal, wood, water, fire, and earth. It was also extremely sturdy and unbreakable. It was also the reason why nobody in the 4 divine kingdoms showed any intention of targeting it. Chapter 973, Cut the Mountain with Wind Blades. It couldn't be denied, the breadth of Zen's master's knowledge far exceeded his expectations. The book entitled, Myriad Manifestations of Nature, was a record of some of the universe's extremely powerful and unique items, including the magnetic sacred mountain. Not only was its refining method recorded in the book, but a number of other aspects went above and beyond Zen's imagination. But because the materials for refining the mountain were rare, Zen had yet to find them. Although the origin of the magnetic sacred mountain wasn't wholly clear, it indeed existed in the great world. At the very least, it was not owned by anyone. If only the Soul Sea Realm Masters of the 4 divine kingdoms could move the mountain would have already settled on the Divine Kingdom continent. But even while Zen finally had the method of collecting the magnetic sacred mountain, there were still a number of hurdles to overcome. A violent storm had been hanging above the chaotic ocean of stars since many years ago. Its wind blades were a great threat to even the Spirit Supreme Realm warriors. Although Zen had already consecutively advanced 2 grades and currently stood at the 3rd grade of the Life and Death realm, it was too unrealistic for him to attempt to block the wind blades with the strength he had. An important point to note was that the most crucial part about collecting the magnetic sacred mountain was stripping off the bottom of the mountain. It was such a sturdy structure that not even dozens of Soul Sea Realm Masters could destroy it. Zen couldn't even dream of doing so. After a moment of pondering, Zen came up with a plan. At this time, the World Commercial Alliance suddenly released a message requesting all kinds of rare materials. Although these materials more or less appeared in the central region, they were extremely difficult to obtain. But brave men after great rewards never ran out. After all, how many people in the world could truly resist such temptations? Some of the materials had been kept in certain clans for generations. Now that they were sold at such a high price, they were all willing to sell them to the World Commercial Alliance. All the materials collected were piecemeal before being sent to the Cloud Hall one after another. Because of the great purchase momentum, it caught the attention of many other sects. After some investigation, it was revealed that the World Commercial Alliance was only helping the Cloud Hall, or perhaps, to speak frankly, it was helping Zen take them all. But why was Zen in need of such uncommon things? What could his purpose have been? It was rumored that he wanted to help the Cloud Hall build a super sect protecting array, along with the rumor that he was preparing to make a breakthrough to the Soul Sea realm. But these rumors were hardly convincing. The Cloud Hall already had a sect-protecting array, and Zen and Letitia were top figures in the central region. The Cloud Hall had no need for another sect-protecting array. Even more ridiculous was the rumor that Zen was about to make a breakthrough to the Soul Sea realm. He was only at the third grade of the Life and Death realm, after all. But Zen was making divine textures, indeed. According to the records in the myriad manifestations of nature, the process of collecting the magnetic sacred mountain was divided into 3 steps. First, the mountain had to be compressed in a small space. Second, the power of the 5 elements had to be used to suppress the entire structure. And third, the mountain would be collected. Already, Zen was making his preparations. With that, his time seemed to grow shorter once again. In the day, he prepared the materials and made the divine textures. At night, he immersed himself in cultivating. In the next 3 months that passed, Zen had no moment to spare. Zen's figure appeared above the sea, south of the central region. Although Letitia and Margaret were insistent of going on the quest with him, Zen refused. While Letitia's strength had improved remarkably, she was still not strong enough to deal with the wind blades. Some of them contained the 5th layer of wind law. Even though Zen's body was tough as a sacred weapon, he would be torn to pieces if he didn't know how to redirect the attacks. After possessing the will of the great world, Zen tried to digest the memories in his head, uncovering numerous secrets. In the northern part of the Divine Kingdom continent, for instance, lay a savage land and some extremely powerful vicious beasts. There were even a number of extremely powerful races among them. But the culture was utterly backward, and countless times more chaotic than the Sea God continent. Also, in a corner of the great world, a glorious civilization was settled, one that was destroyed 500,000 years prior because of the Tower of Sin. Under the conflict of those warriors from the upper world, that continent sank to the bottom of the sea. But no matter how far Zen searched, he couldn't find any memories of the chaotic ocean of stars. It seemed that the will of the great world had no knowledge of the storm, its origins, or what lay in the center of it. It was a strange ordeal, indeed. Moreover, behind the area was a group of shadow creatures whose strength was feared even by the mighty warriors of the celestial position race. Why would they be wandering behind the great world? Were they planning to do something to it? It couldn't be helped. The great world still had many unsolved mysteries. At the moment, Zen didn't have the means to unravel such mysteries. Only collecting the magnetic sacred mountain occupied his thoughts. But while it was impossible for Zen to strip away the bottom of the magnetic sacred mountain with his own strength, the power of the storm could be used instead. The second he entered the range of the storm above the chaotic ocean of stars, raging winds swept over him. The ocean seemed to be sucked into the sky by the violent storm, entwining like water dragons, forming a bridge between the sea and sky. It was quite the spectacle. Zen's figure rapidly shuttled back and forth between the dancing water, and by then, quite a few wind blades were already sweeping toward him in the storm's periphery. The blades were a light cyan color, with only level 1 of wind law, some holding level 2. These didn't pose much of a threat to Zen. He didn't even need to dodge when the wind blades hit him directly. Puff, puff, puff. Even if he didn't manage to transfer the attacks, the wind blades were of no harm to him. As he endured the storm, his speed increased considerably as he flew forward. But he wasn't headed for the magnetic sacred mountain. Through the memories of the world's will, Zen had already ascertained that the mountain was to the west of the chaotic ocean of stars. Instead of flying to the west, he flew south, going straight into the heart of the storm. Of course, he wasn't planning on merely exploring the heart of the storm out of curiosity. It was a necessary step for what he intended to do. If there was some powerful creature in the center of it, he would be doomed. While it was impossible for Zen to strip away the bottom of the magnetic sacred mountain with his own strength, the power of the storm could be used instead. The wind blades were indeed ridiculously powerful. Zen was positive that transferring this power to the mountain could do the trick. 1 wind blade was probably not enough, but 100,000, or maybe 1,000,000 wind blades could work. Taking advantage of the wind blades, Zen believed the magnetic sacred mountain could be removed from its base. A concrete method had to be decided. As Zen advanced to the center of the storm, the wind blades turned sharper and sharper. Even wind blades containing the 3rd or 4th layer of wind law began appearing around him, the colors fluctuating from light to dark shades of cyan. It's not enough. These wind blades are enough to threaten me, but they can't shake the mountain, Zen thought, observing the blades sweeping around him. Even after he attempted to transfer the attacks to the bottom of the mountain, they had no trace of an effect on the mountain. I have to find those black wind blades. Fixing his gaze on the blades, Zen continued to advance. After he had flown for about half a day, the first black wind blade finally appeared before him. Chapter 974, Are They Intelligent? When he saw the wind blade, Zen got pleased, with a hint of joy on his face. He had finally discovered the black wind blade. Realizing that the black wind blade didn't shoot in the right direction, Zen swiftly adjusted his direction and headed straight towards it. Puff! With a muffled sound, the wind blade that contained the fifth layer of wind law directly hit Zen's chest. Power transfer. When the black wind blade hit his chest, Zen ensured to simultaneously use the will of the great world to search for the magnetic sacred mountain. After that, Zen's gaze faintly flickered. An indistinct white mark became visible at the bottom of the magnetic sacred mountain. The wind blade containing the fifth layer of wind law could only leave a faint mark. So how long would it take him to cut this massive magnetic sacred mountain? There was a trace of depression in his face. But Zen resolutely would not give up that easily. During his stay in the central region, he not only focused on cultivating, but he also needed to prepare to fly into the upper world. He quite fully understood then that preparedness ensured success and unpreparedness spelled failure. Since he was able to achieve it with a small price, why wouldn't he do it? So he continued moving forward. As he plodded on, he mentally noted that the number of black wind blades increased, while the number of cyan wind blades decreased. Puff, puff, puff. The moving tracks of the black wind blades were different, and Zen could only try his best to use his body to collide with them. With this constant collisions, streams of power kept transferring to the bottom of the magnetic sacred mountain. 10 streams of power. 100, 1000. In the eyes of the onlookers, these black wind blades were deadly, seeming to represent the death god. But it was not for Zen, as he could not wait to charge at them. He swiftly hit them. Soon he had been able to smash 3000 black wind blades. When Zen checked the magnetic sacred mountain, the power of the 3000 wind blades was transferred by him to the bottom. And now, he had finally cut a little part of the mountain, leaving a tiny cut as thick as a thumb. Witnessing this scene, Zen couldn't help feeling disappointed. He was speechless. His effort of gathering the power of thousands of black wind blades only left a tiny mark on the magnetic sacred mountain. He deduced that a large mountain was always thin at the top part, and was massive at the bottom. How many black wind blades would it take to peel off the magnetic sacred mountain from its base? Would it need hundreds of millions or even billions of wind blades? If so, it might be impossible for Zen to execute that with the wind blades alone. Although there were a lot of black wind blades in the storm, and they were distributed in the sky above the chaotic ocean of stars, but they would not rush towards him all at the same time. Zen admitted that he did not have the power to attract all of the black wind blades, so he would have to rely entirely on himself to hit those black wind blades, which might probably take decades to peel off the magnetic sacred mountain. It wasn't that Zen didn't have the resolution and persistence to move a mountain. And it never daunted him in the first place. It was just that he didn't have enough time. Shaking his head, he could only continue moving closer to the center of the chaotic ocean of stars. Zen had once entered the center of the chaotic ocean of stars. He didn't find anything special aside from a few powerful ferocious beasts. He thought that with the devastating storm, those 11th level beasts probably wouldn't dare to float onto the surface of the sea. The only things left in the surroundings were the black wind blades. When Zen continued to advance more than 1,000 miles, his eyes suddenly flashed. He saw a strange black wind blade rushing towards him at a rapid speed. This black wind blade's shape was the same as that of the black wind blades he hit earlier. But there was something unusual with the way it moved. It would repeatedly disappear and appear during its flight. Sometimes, it could become transparent. And at times it looked black, and the two colors alternatively flickered. The wind law that emitted from it seemed to be stronger. Zen was unable to determine which layer of law power the wind blade contained. To date, Zen had only practiced the first layer of the wind law. He had just learned from the 7 members of the celestial position that the black wind blade held the 5th layer of the wind law. However, the law power contained within the weird wind blade that constantly changed colors was higher than that of the other black wind blades. He could only surmise that this wind blade carried the 6th layer of wind law. Zen was currently a bit worried and disappointed. With the strength of the black wind blades, it would take at least 10 years for him to cut the mountain. But now, he was overjoyed upon seeing this 2-tone wind blade. Dashed towards it, the wind blade moved at a fast speed, cutting into his body the moment he lunged forward. Though it closed in with uncanny precision, it didn't stop from changing its colors even once. The gutsy air current emanating from Zen's body created a thunderous force, causing a whirlpool to surge up from the sea underneath Zen. And the tremendous explosion of that force nearly made the base of the vortex visible. The surge of power arising from the 2-colored wind blade was so terrifying. And most of its power was triumphantly transferred by Zen to the magnetic sacred mountain. Boom! The magnetic sacred mountain that was thousands of miles away from Zen suddenly shook violently. For countless years, this magnetic sacred mountain that held the power of 5 elements had been majestically standing there. And there was no telltale sign of disturbance on the mountain throughout the years. As for even the erosion of the seawater, the slapping of the waves, or the cutting of the wind blades, none of these had been able to shake this mountain. After all, it was far away from the center of the storm. With that massive amount of power directly penetrating the base of the mountain that continued to quake violently, a large splash of seawater began to roll in. And the seawater surrounding the magnetic sacred mountain became foamy, akin to boiling water as bubbles appeared generously, thus refracting the azure sea into a milky white color as though it was a rice soup. It works, Zen blurted out in obvious delight. Just a double-colored wind blade was enough to leave a nearly 10 feet long cut on the magnetic sacred mountain. The sharp cut was precise that it was as if a god wielded a giant axe and chopped the mountain down. It was hard for Zen to imagine the power of the two-colored wind blade. If his execution to transfer the power to the mountain failed miserably in the nick of time, then he would have been sunk without trace by the wind blade. Again, with newfound hope swelling within him, Zen glanced around again. But luck was not on him this time as there was no two-colored wind blade at his side at all. Zen's heart was at ease now, and he was feeling so much better. Since he couldn't find the two-colored wind blade nearby, he continued to advance towards the center of the storm to find more. He steadily flew further ahead. Along the way, there were only a few two-colored wind blades, but Zen did not miss any of them. After encountering dozens of two-colored wind blades, the gap at the bottom of the magnetic sacred mountain had grown larger and larger. Later on, as he carried on with his pace forward, Zen began to hesitate. He realized that he had no clear grasp of what was at the center of this storm. He wasn't afraid of the double-colored wind blades. It was just that if he encountered some powerful creatures at the center of this storm, dealing with them would be impossible for him. Might he be able to escape by then? After a brief moment of hesitation, Zen braced himself, as he gritted his teeth and charged forward. As he made his way towards the center of the storm, he met more and more double-colored wind blades. Every single two-colored wind blade was able to leave a 10-foot deep cut on the magnetic sacred mountain. Although this mountain was huge, it would eventually peel off under such attacking and cutting of the wind blades. Zen's mental state eventually became stable. However, just after Zen advanced for about 200 miles, he discovered a new type of wind blade. It was a golden wind blade. What was stranger was that they were not like those ordinary wind blades which shot into all directions. Instead, they gathered and moved together, like a flock of birds flying smoothly in the air. Are these wind blades intelligent? Zen was amazed as he stared at the golden wind blades. So to speak, the wind blades were the things created in a storm. The stronger the wind blade was, the higher the level of wind law it contained. But no matter how powerful the wind blade was, it might not be able to produce a pearl of wisdom. To put it bluntly, it was nothing but just a gust of wind. There were too many mysteries in this universe that were left unsolved. And Zen fused with the will of the great world, making him all-powerful and invincible, but sadly some things still confused him. While Zen was too engrossed in observing the clumps of golden wind blades, some of them noticed him. One of the golden wind blades circled in the distance, and the other golden wind blades also started chasing after him. Flee. At that unexpected turn of event, this was the only thought that crossed his mind. Chapter 975, Rise Up. The 3,000 black wind blades had only left a tiny cut on the magnetic sacred mountain. But only one double-colored wind blade was necessary to make a 10-foot deep cut into the mountain. There was no getting around the fact that the difference in power of the two types of wind blades was immensely large. If a golden wind blade's power was equal to that of 10,000 double-colored wind blades, then one golden wind blade would be enough to cut right through the magnetic sacred mountain. All Zen needed to do was to attract a single golden wind blade. If he managed to do so, it would save him heaps of time and energy. It would have been the perfect solution, except that there were over 100 golden wind blades chasing after him simultaneously. If he led all of them to the mountain, their collective strength would be excessive. Where can I transfer all the extra power? Zen thought in frustration, furrowing his brows. Should he transfer it to the Divine Kingdom continent or the central region? The blades, terrifying power would probably wreck the Divine Kingdom continent to pieces. Without any sound solution at the moment, Zen decided to flee. Fortunately for him, he had fast enough reflexes and a quick mind. Right after noticing the golden blades were after him, he flew as fast and far as he could to evade them in an instant. With that, he made sure to maintain a safe distance from the threat behind him, In spite of all the precautions he had taken, the thought of 100 golden blades flying after him at top speed was enough to send shivers down his spine. Zen was well aware of what the blades could do to him. With such power not far behind him, he knew that he would never be truly safe. The blades can easily catch up with me in a fraction of a second, he thought, beads of sweat running down his temples. At that moment, he gave up on thinking of a solution. He was somewhat unwilling to let the Divine Kingdom continent and central region take the blades' damage. He wouldn't have the Sea God continent take the hit too. If the blades managed to catch up to him, he would probably have to sacrifice the savage land after peeling off the mountain. Suddenly, a brilliant thought came to his mind. I have a token with the word, mountain on it. It should allow me to enter the fairy palace. Just as he was readying himself to stage his plan, the golden wind blades stalled and began circling the air. In the next moment, they did a 180-degree turn and moved away from Zen. Puzzled, Zen stopped mid-flight when he saw the blades moving in the opposite direction. With a smile, he muttered, "They really are intelligent, huh?" Zen sighed in relief as he observed the golden wind blades disappear into the distance. That was too close an encounter. As he began to analyze what had happened, he realized one thing: the golden wind blades didn't dare chase too far. Instead, they seemed to be protecting something. Pushing the curiosity to the back of his mind, Zen continued on his way. While he flew above the chaotic ocean of stars, his curiosity about the center of the storm grew exponentially, becoming all too tempting to satisfy. But ultimately, he did not want to risk his life on a whim. No matter what lay in the heart of the storm, it was impossible for it to exist in the great world. Even if I sacrifice this world, I would still barely make it into the center, he thought. Forget it, I must focus on finding the two-colored wind blades. With that, Zen continued on his way, even as the thought lingered on his mind. One double-colored wind blade could make a cut over 10 feet deep. What about 100, 1,000, 10,000 of them? After 15 days, Zen had already been blessed with over 30,000 two-colored wind blades. At the time, the bottom of the magnetic sacred mountain had already been completely cut off from the ground. Only a few pillars on its sides were keeping the mountain in place. But with Zen's current strength, he still wouldn't be able to do anything to move the mountain. Puff, 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 puff. After several more two-colored wind blades collided with the mountain, the entire structure was finally stripped off completely. Releasing a deep breath, Zen looked toward the center of the storm and shook his head. Curiosity was what killed the cat. He knew he shouldn't be so reckless in his actions. It wasn't a place he could simply approach just as he was. With that, he turned around and shot toward the magnetic sacred mountain. With the mountain 10,000 miles away from Zen, it would take him only several hours to reach it. Although he had observed the place many times through the will of the great world, it was the first time he was visiting the mountain in person. Only a sixth of the entire magnetic sacred mountain was above sea level, its enormous entirety was hidden in the water. Whoosh! When he arrived, he flew over and stood at the mountain's peak. When he saw the mountain under his feet, Zen's eyes flashed. Suddenly, he thought of the magnetic stone that Callan, the Divine Kingdom Crown Prince, had pulled out when they were on the Divine Emperor's secret land. The stone was as tall as a person, and it seemed to fit perfectly on top of the mountain. But Zen had no clue as to how the stone broke. At the moment, the bottom of the mountain had already been peeled off. The next step was to lay down the divine textures and finally bring the mountain away. It was no easy feat. According to the myriad manifestations of nature, it was necessary to put 33 six-star divine textures on the mountain to form a Sumeru space. Only after it was fettered could it be refined. With that in mind, Zen slowly took out the items he had prepared from his space ring and imprinted the first divine texture onto the mountain's surface. Zen leapt into the air and crashed down the surging waves, circling the structure as the divine textures in his hands landed on the mountain one after another. In the beginning, everything went rather smoothly. But just as Zen was concentrating on imprinting the textures on the mountain, dozens of creatures charged right at him from the depths of the sea. The sound from the sea wasn't one easily heard. Zen only felt an abnormal movement of water behind him. When he looked down behind him, his brows furrowed. 10th level beasts. Such a creature was comparable to a life and death realm warrior. The magnetic sacred mountain had existed for many, many years. Naturally, quite a number of creatures grew to rely on the magnetic sacred mountain for survival. Seeing an invader in their territory, it was only natural that they attacked him. Among the 10th level fierce beasts were ugly, strange fish, huge-bodied beasts, soft-bodied beasts, some kind of octopus riddled with sharp teeth, and some creatures of odd shapes that Zen couldn't even recognize. "You're courting death," Fools! Unafraid of the creatures, Zen merely looked down on them. In his eyes, even though they were comparable to the life and death realm warriors, they were still no different from ordinary fish. But this time around, Zen planned to take the chance to train himself by taking on the fierce beasts. As the chaotic energy gushed from his belly, a long sword appeared in his hand. Whoosh! The sword intent activated by the chaotic energy began forming numerous gray cyclones, creating a string of tiny bubbles in the water. Puff, puff, puff. With a muffled sound, the first group of beasts were cut into countless pieces. The sharpness surpassed even Zen's expectations. After changing the life vitality in his body, Zen's strength had a qualitative change. But at the moment, he was facing mere 10th level beasts. Although their strength was comparable to that of the life and death realm warriors, their intelligence was far inferior. Still, the chaotic energy also had a weakness. The life vitality was created by nature. If a warrior's life vitality was used up, he would be able to continuously absorb the vitality of heaven and earth to replenish it. If one wanted to do it quicker, one could make use of the life vitality crystal. Normally, the chaotic energy could only be refined and created within the warrior's body. But according to the deduction of Zen's master, everything in the world evolved from chaos. In turn, everything could be turned into chaos. Because Zen had yet to cultivate to such a state, he had to endure his weakness for the time being. It was still impossible for him to do anything. The sword attack had killed dozens of 10th level and 9th level beasts. The creatures came to realize that Zen was indeed very powerful. At that moment, they all ran for their lives. Fortunately for them, Zen had no intention of chasing after them. In the first place, he had no clue why the ferocious beasts attacked him. Perhaps they knew that he was going to move the magnetic sacred mountain away. Still, Zen knew that he had destroyed the home they had inhabited for tens of thousands of years. If the creatures hadn't recklessly attacked him, he didn't have the heart to kill them. After chasing the beasts away, Zen swiftly laid out all the divine textures on the mountain. After finalizing the preparations, he began activating the textures one after another according to the method recorded in the myriad manifestations of nature. Then, he returned to the very top of the magnetic sacred mountain and activated the final divine texture. Suddenly, Zen slammed his palm hard on the surface of the mountain as he shouted, "Rise up." Chapter 976, The Hook in Shadow. At the same time, the divine textures began to emit a faint halo of light, as if some mysterious power was wakening up. The halo was revolving around the magnetic sacred mountain. And then, something incredible happened. The entire mountain itself shook and slowly rose up from the sea. The magnetic sacred mountain, in appearance, was not so different from an ordinary mountain. It was about 10,000 feet tall and proportionately wide. However, it was definitely a lot heavier than an ordinary mountain. The latter was made of commonplace rocks, while the magnetic sacred mountain was made of magnetic stones. These magnetic stones were tough, and slightly heavier than common rocks. They contained the power of 5 different elements, which prevented any type of law from invading them. That was the reason why the mountain could not be destroyed by knives or swords. There were other mountains in this world too. Some were the type which contained a lot of rich and pure iron ore. In fact, they might have been much heavier than the magnetic sacred mountain. However, they were useless to Zen and he wasn't going to refine them. As Zen continued to ascend, the part of the mountain which had been immersed in the sea gradually rose up towards the surface. Finally, the entire mountain left the sea level and floated in the air. Some living beings that had gathered on the mountain left their nests and jumped into the sea, startled by the sudden change in atmosphere. At that moment, Zen's finger gently flicked and dozens of drops of blood left his body. Blood refinement technique. To take ownership of the magnetic sacred mountain, not only did Zen need to set up the 6-star divine textures, but there was also a more important part, the blood refinement technique which was recorded in the myriad manifestations of nature. After the drops of blood had flowed out of Zen's body, they slowly rotated and revolved around in the air. Under the circulation of the blood refinement technique, they then began to merge with one another and quickly formed a palm-sized, blood-refined rune. The blood-refined rune continued to spin around and began to descend towards the gigantic mountain underneath it. The magnetic sacred mountain was enhanced by the power of 5 elements, so it was hard to collect it because no matter which type of law was used, it wouldn't be able to react completely with the mountain. However, the blood refinement technique had a miraculous effect in refining the mountain. It was because of this reason that Zen had begun to admire his master more and more. However, he didn't know whether or not the various secret techniques within the myriad manifestations of nature were all created by his master. Maybe his master had collected them while he was traveling. As Zen's blood-refined rune hit the mountain began to shake at a much faster speed. Finally, it began to rotate at a pace which was comparable to that of the drops of blood in the blood-refined rune. Whir, whir, whir. The mountain was huge and the momentum was remarkable. Its spinning caused the wind to be torn apart and the whirring sound was heard for miles apart. From time to time, some light cyan wind blades would hit the mountain and emit a muffled sound. As soon as the blood-refined rune had come into being, a connection was established between it and Zen. However, the rune had been formed from the blood within his body, so the connection was extremely weak. As a result, Zen couldn't control the mountain at all. But that wasn't a cause for worry. The 33 divine textures surrounding the mountain were there for a purpose. They suddenly erupted a resplendent light. The power contained within each of these 33 divine textures was different. Zen had spent quite a bit of time and effort in crafting them since they were 6-star ones. Sometimes, he even had to discuss it with the Cyan Dragon and ask him for help. According to the Cyan Dragon, the purpose of these 33 divine textures was to temporarily suppress the power of the 5 elements within the mountain. That was the only way in which the blood-refined rune would be able to completely immerse itself within the mountain. And now, whatever was happening was just as the Cyan Dragon had said. The magnetic sacred mountain, which originally had several colors revolving within it, was now changing. As the 33 divine textures showed their effects, the 5 elements within the mountain suddenly stopped flowing. The numerous colors of the mountain morphed themselves into a pale yellow shade. The power of the 5 elements has disappeared, right? Zen mumbled. He also could feel that the laws within the mountain had disappeared now. There were still traces of the earth law in it, which meant that by now, the mountain had turned into an ordinary earth mountain. Puff, puff. As a few light cyan wind blades hit the mountain, they immediately caused several deep dents on it. Previously, these wind blades that contained only the second layer of the wind law were unable to cause any substantial damage to the magnetic sacred mountain. In fact, even if they had been black-colored wind blades, they would have hardly left a few small marks on it. But the mountain had transformed for the time being. If Zen had not suppressed the power of the 5 elements in this way, it would simply have been wishful thinking to subdue the mountain. Whoever thought up of this method to suppress the power within the mountain was clearly a precocious genius. The Cyan Dragon was watching the scene from Zen's mind and marveled at the technique. All right then, the power of the 5 elements of the mountain is suppressed now. Refine it. In that instant, several mysterious seals appeared in Zen's hand. Meanwhile, the blood-refined rune which was originally lying on the surface of the mountain was now sinking into its interior. Draw a 6-sided world with the space boundary. Collect the mountain. At that moment, 6 of the 33 6-star divine textures erupted an intense power of the space law. Under their action, the power of the space law instantly spread out and formed a 6-sided world, encompassing the magnetic sacred mountain. This was actually a Sumeru space, and the magnetic sacred mountain was inside it. Things were beginning to look much more interesting now. As the Sumeru space gradually stabilized, the 6-sided world began to shrink rapidly, forcing the mountain to also become smaller and smaller. The decrease in size caused a change in speed, as required by the laws which governed motion of bodies. The spin became faster and faster. The mountain, which was about 10,000 feet tall, eventually turned into a small palm-sized object right in front of Zen's eyes. It kept spinning, its surface still earthy yellow. After suppressing the power of the 5 elements, it was going to take some time for the mountain to recover, so Zen left it alone. Once the 6-star divine textures, energy ran out, the magnetic sacred mountain would return to its original state. As he held the continuously spinning mini hill in his hand, Zen had a satisfied smile on his face. Right now, the power of the 5 elements was suppressed, and the mountain was useless. A single punch from a life and death realm powerhouse would destroy it easily. What Zen was marveling at was that such a method to suppress the power of the 5 elements wasn't something an ordinary person could come up with, and was only recorded in the myriad manifestations of nature. The Cyan Dragon had expressed amazement at the idea because even he felt that it was really ingenious to use 33 6-star divine textures to dissolve the power of the 5 elements and transform it into pure earth law. As far as the Cyan Dragon knew, many sacred places in the upper world had set up their sect-protecting arrays with the power of the 5 elements inside them. This was because the 5 elements together didn't have an absolute weakness. Thus, not only could these 33 divine textures be used to destroy the power of the 5 elements of the magnetic sacred mountain, even the most powerful sect-protecting arrays would become as fragile as an eggshell if they were attacked in this way. However, the magnetic sacred mountain would be strong again once it recovered its power of the 5 elements. And that was when it would come in handy. At that time, Soul Sea Realm powerhouses could do nothing to the mountain, and even Spirit Supreme Realm martial artists could only sigh in helplessness if they encountered this mountain. If they wanted to break it by force, they would probably need 5 or even 7 layers of law power. However, there weren't too many supreme warriors with such law power in the upper world, so the mountain would definitely be a great support for Zen in his future endeavors. Zen had obtained the magnetic sacred mountain now and his goal had been achieved. However, just as he was collecting the mountain, his heart suddenly skipped a beat as an extremely uncomfortable feeling arose within his heart. His sixth sense was telling him something. It seems like someone is spying on me. Zen's brow creased as he swept his gaze across the area, spreading out his senses at the same time. The wind blades swept and the waves churned, but there was nothing else in the world. Not a single living soul. As for those living beings in the chaotic ocean of stars, Zen had made them suffer bitterly, so they had hidden deep and wouldn't dare to show up. Zen could not find any living creature spying on him, but the wariness in his heart grew even stronger by the minute. Right at that moment, a crack suddenly appeared in the space not far behind him. In fact, it looked like the very fabric of space had been cut open by someone. In that hole, it was pitch black. It looked like the reverse side of the world where even sunlight couldn't reach. At the same time, a long black hook shot out of it and rushed straight towards Zen. Chapter 977, A Mad Rush to Ascend. It's the shadow creature. Suddenly Zen's head throbbed. The black hook seemed to be made from the bones of some animal and it was incredibly fast. It charged straight at Zen, trying to drag him into the space crack. But he was quick to react. Coincidentally, a gale swept over him. He immediately followed the gale and floated slightly in the air. His body suddenly drifted a couple of feet horizontally and dodged the hook just in time. The black hook missed its target and continued hovering in the air. Then it actually turned around and chased after Zen once again. Cloud chasing skill. How could Zen afford to stop? Even the 7 Spirit Supreme Realm Masters of the Celestial Position had fled for their lives in the face of the shadow creature. If he were to get dragged into this crack, he would be doomed. Whoosh! The storm contained a strong wind law. As he employed the cloud-chasing skill, the forceful energy within his body also erupted, giving Zen an amazing boost. His speed reached its peak. However, the black hook too sped up as it chased him. It seemed determined not to give up until it caught Zen. Oh no, why can't I escape it? Zen's perception told him that the black hook was moving faster and getting closer to him. His expression darkened. When the black hook was only a dozen feet away from him, Zen suddenly turned around mid-flight, and the power within his body shot out crazily. If he could not escape it, he could at least try his best to get out. This was what was on his mind. However, there was a dramatic turn of events at this point. As Zen was focusing on fleeing, the hook suddenly straightened up. Although the tip of the hook was still emitting rays of cold light, it paused and couldn't move from its spot at all. Zen's eyes glistened as a smile appeared on his face. The hook wasn't long enough to reach him. This hook was released by the shadow creature from the back side of the world. The hook could leave the back of the world, but the shadow creature couldn't. In the next moment, the black hook retracted with a whoosh. It seemed as if the shadow creature had given up. However, Zen didn't dare to drop his guard. The shadow creatures seemed to be active on the back side of the chaotic ocean of stars. He was not sure what these creatures wanted to do with him, but it would definitely not be a wise decision to stay here. So he immediately sped away towards Central Region. Indeed, just as Zen had guessed, space cracks appeared now and then and hooks emerged from them to chase after Zen on the way back too. But Zen managed to escape in time when the space cracks appeared and the hooks stretched out. He had never been caught by any hook in his mad dash. This hot pursuit continued all the way to the edge of the chaotic ocean of stars, only then did the shadow creatures give up. Zen felt strange that the shadow creatures suddenly gave up chasing him. Logically speaking, there was no limit to the range of movement of the shadow creatures. Even if they had reached the central region, they would still be able to hunt him down in the shadows, but why would they suddenly stop there? Of course, it was a good thing for Zen. He heaved a sigh of relief. If those creatures continued to follow him, then even if Zen entered the Cloud Hall, they would still be able to hunt him down in the shadows. Then never would there be days of peace for him. However, Zen couldn't figure out why these creatures suddenly stopped chasing him. Could it be that there was something they were afraid of in the central region? This was impossible. Zen immediately disregarded this idea. It was true that there were many dangerous areas in the central region, but once one reached the life and death realm, one could enter and exit the land freely. For example, although the dreamy swampland was dangerous and mysterious for ordinary martial artists, it wasn't a scary place for Zen. On the way back to the Cloud Hall, Zen maintained vigilant and various conjectures came to his mind. After some thought, Zen came up with a reasonable conjecture. Probably in the back of the central region there existed some powerful being. The shadow creatures were extremely fearful of this powerful being, so they did not dare to invade the back of the central region. But what was on the back of the central region? Curiosity arose in his heart. With his current strength, he could forcibly tear open space and enter the back of the central region to figure out the mystery. However, after some thought, he gave up on the idea. No matter what was on the back side of the central region, it was not something he could afford to offend. At the very least, the powerful being had been in the central region for a long time, and it had never appeared in the history of the central region. So Zen decided that he'd better not explore the back side of the central region. Zen knew that his luck was good, but if he sought death himself, he would die no matter how strong his luck was. Zen had returned to the Cloud Hall after obtaining the magnetic sacred mountain. In addition to practicing the primal chaos technique, he also needed to study the magnetic sacred mountain. Its simplest and crudest use was to smash people. If he refined a common mountain and used it to attack people, a powerful Soul Sea Realm master would be able to smash it with one punch. However, Zen had a magnetic sacred mountain and it was not so easily blocked. Of course, smashing people was just its simplest function. One could extract magnetic sacred light from the magnetic sacred mountain, which had the power of the 5 elements that had evolved over countless years in the magnetic sacred mountain. It could be absorbed and used by the cultivator. The myriad manifestations of nature stated that the magnetic sacred light could suppress the power of all 5 elements in this world. After studying the magnetic sacred mountain for 2 months, one early morning, Zen suddenly felt a tremor in his soul. An extremely joyful feeling arose from the depths of his soul. It was the joy that came from the world's will. Zen, who was still in the midst of cultivating, had a strange expression on his face. He immediately closed his eyes, and raised his eyebrows, and remarked, "The flying passage has been repaired." He didn't know who had repaired it. Perhaps it was the celestial position, or the human race. According to what the old man from the celestial position had explained, the celestial position had probably reached a truce with the human race. At the very least, Derek would not look for trouble with the celestial position. As for who was responsible or taking the evil dragon from the heavenly stellar secret land, Zen had no idea. He didn't expect the flying passage to be repaired in such a short period of time. Other than Zen, who himself had felt great joy, all the creatures below the Soul Sea realm were indifferent in the great world. Life and death realm masters weren't strong enough to make the great world repel them. They were unable to ascend, so they didn't care if the flying passage was repaired or not. Contrarily, for the mighty warriors of the Soul Sea realm, it was big news. The powerful masters of the Soul Sea realm in the 4 divine kingdoms immediately felt an invisible expulsion force being exerted on their bodies. It was trying to squeeze them out of their plane. The powerful masters of the Soul Sea realm were ecstatic. Even War Emperor York and War King Wind were thrilled. They had dreamed of the day they could ascend to the upper world. The appearance of this mighty force was great news for them. 5 minutes after the repelling force appeared, a bright silver light erupted from the Harlan Divine Kingdom and shot up towards the sky. Dang, who is this guy that is flying away? Why he is in such a mad rush? Turner cursed as he stood watching this scene from the palace of the Harlan Divine Kingdom. The powerful masters of the Soul Sea realm in the 4 divine kingdoms had been waiting for this moment for countless years. No matter how anxious everyone was, they couldn't risk ascending recklessly. The 4 divine kingdoms had a good relationship with each other, and it was the strength of each divine kingdom that maintained the peace among them. If all the Soul Sea realm masters in the Harlan Divine Kingdom ascended to the upper world and only Turner was left, how could the Divine Kingdom continue its reign? It was a crisis situation, so Turner immediately summoned all the Soul Sea realm masters in the Harlan Divine Kingdom to the palace. The problem was that all the powerful warriors at the Soul Sea realm wanted to ascend to the upper world. They could have immediately ascended to the upper world after entering the Soul Sea realm, but the truth was that most of them had been stuck at the Soul Sea realm for countless years with no scope of ascending. Now they were in a mad rush to ascend to the upper world and nobody could stop them, not even Turner. Everyone recognizes you as the ruler of the Divine Kingdom, and once I ascend to the upper world, I might still regard you as my king for the sake of our old friendship. But if you think you can stop me from ascending to the upper world, then you must be dreaming. Most of the Soul Sea realm masters in the Harlan Divine Kingdom had this same thought in their minds. Chapter 978, Improving Too Fast. Several bright, silver lights shot up to the sky after Turner called a meeting. Only half of the Soul Sea realm masters stayed and rushed towards the Imperial Palace, choosing to obey his command instead. Those that obeyed were mostly people who had a good relationship with Turner, with some coming from the Joe family. Dozens of bright lights scattered all throughout the sky with the Soul Sea Realm warrior's ascension. It was a wondrous sight that left all citizens of the 4 divine kingdoms in awe. Titles had been handed over, management of family affairs had been imparted, and instructions to disciples had already been given. The Soul Sea Realm masters could ascend peacefully to the upper world. Turner, War King Wind, Scott, and War Emperor York watched solemnly as they watched their subordinates ascend to the upper world before them. Though happy for this opportunity, their hearts were a bit heavy at the thought of falling behind because of their responsibilities. They did not enjoy the same level of freedom as these warriors. They were emperors who needed to do more than just give a list of instructions to their descendants in order to ensure proper management of kingdom affairs. It would be quite a while before they could ascend with no worries. War Emperor York was especially infuriated. Almost all of York Divine Kingdom's Soul Sea Realm masters had chosen to ascend, with only one opting to remain, his younger brother. It didn't help that they all readily chose to go their way the instant the passageway was repaired, completely ignoring War Emperor York's summons. He had wanted to threaten them, to tell them that he would wipe out their clans if they ascended without his permission. However, he held himself back. He was also bound to ascend at some point. What if the enemies he made now came back and sought revenge on his clan once he left? It wasn't practical to lose his clan over a momentary feeling of rage. Still, he couldn't help but grit his teeth at the sight of the illuminated sky. He had never been a magnanimous ruler and had treated his kingdom's Soul Sea Realm warriors harshly. Now that they had been presented with a way out of his bondage, it was no surprise that none of them were willing to obey him, and they chose to escape from his clutches instead. There were considerably more Soul Sea Realm warriors that chose to stay from the other 3 divine kingdoms. However, the number was still terribly low, and the Divine Kingdom continent would be sure to see a reshuffling of powers among the 4 divine kingdoms. Gone was the age of the Soul Sea Realm masters, replaced by the emergence of the Life and Death Realm warriors, who now had the opportunity to compete and establish a new order. On the other side of the world, the same phenomena could not be observed in the Sea God continent. There weren't as many Soul Sea Realm warriors here compared to the Divine Kingdom continent. Furthermore, the entire place was still in a state of chaos, and the 2 or 3 Soul Sea Realm masters in each race served as the sole guardians of their people. There was no way they would willingly leave with the imminent threat of extinction by the hands of other races. They would not ascend right away, but Miguel and the others still discussed the matter quite seriously. Everyone took this as good news. It was a great opportunity to ascend and further improve oneself, after all. However, this wasn't the case for Amber. The Tower of Sin had been opened completely, and there was no doubt that the Sea God continent would soon see an explosive rise in powerful warriors. The human race and the demon knight race would inevitably become the rulers of the continent, considering that they held the reins within the tower. Amber had full confidence in the capacity of the demon knight race to flourish even without her leadership, so what was stopping her? She, of course, desired ascension once. Her talent had been recognized by the Tower of Sin. Even if she had only ranked in the 2nd row of the talent tablet, she was definitely an exceptional genius even in the upper world. She knew she was strong and had unlimited potential that she could utilize to contribute even more to her race if she ascended to the upper world. However, the recent circumstances turned this desire into a mere pipe dream. Right now, Amber was currently, albeit involuntarily, entangled in the conflict between 2 queens. Zen had destroyed the Queen of Punishment's statue twice and even came into a head-on conflict with her. The Queen had ordered Amber to kill both Zen and Lavender during that confrontation. However, Amber chose to ignore her orders, meaning she committed a capital offense by defying the will of her queen. She could imagine a terrible fate waiting for her in the upper world if she ever chose to ascend at this point in time. The fact left a bitter taste in her mouth. Forcibly staying at the Soul Sea Realm all her life wasn't really what she had in mind for herself. She was still quite young, only 200 years old, and she had ambitions. How could someone so powerful and talented such as her be willing to waste her potential in the lower world? But of course, she must face the consequences of her actions. The Central region, meanwhile, had no Soul Sea Realm masters, so there was no issue of ascension. Still, all sorts of creatures from various places took part in this momentous event. Some came from savage lands, others from the boundless ocean. In the midst of it all, Zen was the only one aware of such an important occasion in the Central region. Everything was the same in Central region, with its people treating it as a normal day, going about their normal, everyday lives. He had already gone through his 3rd life and death tribulation. As long as the mysterious black eye did not appear, then he was safe. The pill the old man gave him also continued to help increase his cultivation base, which was of great help to Zen. Time passed. Zen usually occupied his days cultivating and spending time with his 3 women, but he had also recently started paying attention to the happenings in the 4 divine kingdoms. He heard that almost all of the Soul Sea Realm warriors had chosen to ascend to the upper world. What surprised him was the fact that Fiona, the girl with the genuine Phoenix bloodline, had ascended as well. This initially shocked Zen, but, after some investigation, he found out that she hadn't actually ascended with her own strength. Fiona had just reached the life and death realm when the power of the genuine Phoenix bloodline burst out from her body and produced a special flame. This mysterious flame whisked her away and made her disappear from this world, and Zen guessed that she might have entered a supreme world of the genuine Phoenix. He had promised to visit her in the Divine Kingdom continent, but he didn't think he'd be able to make good on that promise now. The 100,000 supreme worlds were unimaginably vast, and a reunion with Fiona was close to impossible. He did not dwell on this and chose to focus on cultivating instead. 2 years passed. His cultivation base kept rising steadily, and Lavender's soul was also slowly recovering in the soul-nurturing wood. As for Brianna, Zen had helped her communicate with the Cyan Dragon several times. According to him, there was no way to remove the soul-sealing spell while in the lower world. She would have to return to the upper world for that. However, it would be impossible for Zen to bring her along once he ascended in the future. There was a simple method to send her back through the Dragon Soar arena, but this suggestion of his was quickly shot down by both Brianna and the Cyan Dragon. Even though Brianna belonged to the genuine dragon race, she refused to return due to some conflicts with the other members. When Zen heard this, he quickly dropped the idea. He was left with no choice but to place her body deep inside Cloud Hall and have people guard it closely. He would just have to ascend to the upper world, find a solution, and then return to the lower world at some point in the future to help her remove the soul-sealing spell. Zen continued to improve as his cultivation base kept rising rapidly. He soon experienced his 4th life and death tribulation, just 3 months after his 3rd. As his cultivation base rose, the intervals between the tribulations grew shorter and shorter. Truth be told, Zen had almost wanted to purposely impede the improvement of his cultivation. It was just a peaceful point in his life wherein he could relax and spend as much time as he wanted with his girls. However, there was no stopping his lightning-fast improvement. He told himself that he would try to suppress himself from ascending even if he reached the Soul Sea realm. But after his 5th life and death tribulation, it seemed that the great world suddenly began to reject him. Chapter 979, Ascending. It was only after a warrior entered the Soul Sea realm that he would be repelled by the great world, since it was only during this time that a world would have formed inside his body. Zen was only at the 5th level of the life and death realm, so he shouldn't be feeling the repelling force yet. Why had it come so early? Besides, hadn't he already fused with the world's will? Why was it rejecting him then? He wanted an answer to his questions, but it wasn't something that the great world would be able to provide for him. Besides, the world's will was not born out of a singular being but of a collection of all living creatures. To question it was folly. Still, Zen tried as hard as he could to fight off the repelling force by culling his cultivation. To his surprise, his resistance consumed all his strength. This is not right, he muttered to himself in confusion. During his investigation of the 4 divine kingdoms and the Sea God continent through the great world's will, Zen noticed that Amber and the other Soul Sea Realm masters had also felt the repelling force but were able to easily suppress it. In short, it didn't cause as much trouble to them as it did to Zen, who wasn't even supposed to feel it in the first place. Ever since he broke through to the 5th level of the life and death realm, the formless repelling force only grew stronger day by day. It almost grew exponentially. At first he was relaxed and comforted himself with the fact that he'd be able to resist it if he exerted enough effort. However, the following days proved him wrong. The 2nd day was fine and he only felt a mild feeling of repellence. On the 3rd day, however, the force was so strong that it completely distracted him from his cultivation. By the 4th day, his struggle was already very apparent from the bitter look on his face. As the days passed, Zen had to continually use more and more power to suppress the repelling force. Letitia had noticed this sudden change in his behavior and was extremely worried, thinking that he was unwell. However, this couldn't be possible since his level of cultivation rendered him immune to any kind of disease. There was no way that his suffering was brought on by some kind of ailment. When she asked him what was wrong, Zen tried to play it cool and assured her that he was okay. However, on the 5th day, Zen was unable to bear it anymore. He quickly gathered his 3 wives and told them the truth, that he was being repelled by the great world and would soon have to leave them for his inevitable ascension. The shock was clearly painted upon his three wives' beautiful faces. They knew for a fact that Zen would one day ascend to the upper world. It was his fate, and they had long since accepted that a person as mighty as him was bound to go to a higher place. However, he was still at the 5th level of the life and death realm. Why was the great world taking him away from them so soon? They wanted to shout, to cry, to hold on to him for dear life, but the suffering etched on their husband's face was too much for them to bear. Letitia felt particularly depressed once she accepted his imminent departure. She knew all good things had to end, but she did not expect that it would be this soon. Zen felt even worse. He had merged with this great world's will and had become a sort of spokesperson for this plane. He did not know why this great world was kicking him out so early. Not even the Cyan Dragon could figure out why this had happened. It was extremely peculiar and also depressing on Zen's part. In the end, the Cyan Dragon suggested that this might have something to do with the primal chaos technique he practiced. The ascension of a warrior was actually related to the world within one's body. A warrior could only ascend after forming a world within his body, and what constituted the world within the body was a massive life vitality sea. Although Zen hadn't formed a world within his body, what was inside Zen wasn't life vitality but chaotic energy. Maybe the Cyan Dragon was right. Zen's practice of the primal chaos technique had placed him in a completely different path that might have led to the great world forcibly rejecting him and caused an early ascension. Perhaps even if his master had been here, he couldn't explain it, either. The Cyan Dragon's conjecture kind of made sense. During the 5th day, Zen had no choice but to use 1/3 of his strength to suppress himself. On the 6th day, he resorted to using the power of the dragon scales. Only in this way would he be able to avoid being sent away to the upper world. It was during this time that he knew he would not last long on this plane. Both Letitia and Aura had already stopped cultivating 2 days ago to spend more time with him. As they parted ways this time, they would never know when they would see each other again. Margaret continued to cling on to him all day long. She was very clear that she too would depart from the central region and enter the Apeiron Tower in the Purple Power world. Unbeknownst to them, Margaret was faced with a dilemma. Once she finished her cultivation in the Purple Power world, how would she ever find Zen in the upper world? It was a place that she couldn't even fathom, so finding Zen in the future worried her greatly. Resisting the repelling force was extremely difficult this time around, and the dragon scales' powers were not inexhaustible. Zen had to activate the dragon scales in batches, switching out the ones that had dimmed down as he tried to prolong his stay here in the lower world. By noon, Margaret came by and presented him with a ton of dishes. They had all gathered together in the ice palace, and his 3 ladies all looked a bit sad at this probable last meal with him. Zen wanted to say something, to leave some kind of reminder before he left. However, he didn't feel the need to do so. Letitia was extremely strong and he knew nobody in Central Region could pose a threat to her. But he was afraid that she would accidentally break into the backside of the world, so he gently reminded her about that. Zen had held on as much as he could, but it was while he was imparting his last few words that he realized that he could no longer suppress the repelling force. Once the power of the dragon scales disappeared, a bright, silver light wrapped around him. Zen forced a smile at Letitia and the other 2. Letitia looked as if she wanted to say something, but the light was too bright and it hurt her to look at Zen anymore. Just as the brightness was getting too much, it suddenly shot up to the sky, taking Zen away from them. It had been nighttime and this brilliant streak of light was even brighter than lightning. The cloudy city witnessed how the strongest warrior in Central Region ascended to the upper world, leaving behind 3 beauties in his wake. Of course, people who had seen the bright light weren't aware that it had carried Zen away, so all sorts of rumors circulated regarding this seemingly strange phenomena. The 3 girls were left alone in the empty hall, the feeling of emptiness settling in their hearts. Margaret was sad, but she was evidently the calmest out of all of them. This strange sense of security stemmed from her faith and confidence that she would be able to meet Zen again soon enough. She turned to Letitia, who looked sad. "What were you planning to say to Zen just now?" Letitia pursed her lips and lowered her head to look at the floor. "Nothing." Her face immediately betrayed her. But since she didn't want to tell them, Margaret thought it best not to pry. Letitia stood up to leave, but just as she did, she felt some kind of discomfort in her throat and she suddenly began to retch all over the floor. It was at this moment that they realized what she was probably going to tell Zen earlier: she was pregnant. Actually, it had already been a few days since Letitia found out. She wanted to tell Zen, but she just didn't have the opportunity ever since she found out of his imminent ascension to the upper world. It had been easy for her to suppress the urge to vomit in front of him, however, it wasn't recommended since nausea was a natural symptom for pregnant women. With him gone, Letitia stopped hiding and thus vomited so suddenly. Why didn't you tell him? Margaret asked. Letitia merely shook her head. It wasn't the right time. Margaret shook her head but smiled. It doesn't matter. I'll tell him when I meet him. Letitia stared at Margaret. What do you mean? She asked, feeling some sort of strangeness in her heart at Margaret's words. Nothing, Margaret said. I'll be leaving Central Region tomorrow. I'm going to go straight to the ethereal spirit sect and bid farewell to my great-grandfather and Brent. You're going to the Purple Power World? Letitia asked. Despite that Zen hadn't told her outright, Letitia knew Zen wanted her to take care of both Margaret and Aura in his stead, considering that she was now the most powerful warrior in Central Region. Margaret nodded. Yes, she said with a smug face. With Zen gone, Margaret returned to her original willful manner. I forbid you to leave, Letitia ordered with a frown. She didn't expect this at all. But how could Margaret possibly listen to Letitia? She let out a snort. You have no right to stop me. Letitia knew this very well. Of course she had no right to tell Margaret where she could go. However, there was a selfish reason behind Letitia's reaction. On the day of her wedding, she too had seen the old man from the celestial position speaking to Margaret. She assumed that their conversation had something to do with her purple power body. Now that she had confirmed her suspicions, she was hesitant in letting Margaret leave. Letitia knew that once Margaret entered the purple power world and cultivated, she would advance way faster than she ever could and be able to ascend to the upper world sooner. The two bickered about this for a while, not noticing Aura, who had grown quiet beside them. Aura knew that she was the weakest among the three of them, which meant she would have to put in 10 times the effort in order to catch up. It would be hard, but her determination had soared towards new heights. She was dead set in working hard to be able to ascend and see Zen again one day. What she didn't know was that, in the future, she would also have her own fortune. Chapter 980, The Ascending Well. Zen was enveloped by the bright silver light. He flew faster and higher with every passing minute. An invisible force pushed him away from the plane and towards the boundless sky. Living beings that were too powerful were usually excluded from the plane. But the celestial position warriors had probably used some kind of a secret technique to avoid the repelling force. It was like a person sinking into the water, not knowing how to swim and finding it difficult to overcome the buoyant force. If Zen ever had the urge to return to the great world in the future, he would probably have to master this secret technique. He looked down at the dark continents. At first, he could vaguely see lights from large cities like Cloudy City and Oracle City. But as he continued to fly upwards, the continents shrank in his field of vision. Soon after, he could look at the Divine Kingdom continent and the Central Region. The sound of the wind mixed with a metallic noise gave rise to strong gales that assaulted him. These all-conquering gales, however, couldn't cause any damage to Zen right now. The bright silver light had formed a special protective layer. Normal attacks would only pierce through his body, without causing any damage to him. Once he passed through the layer of gales, Zen continued to rise. He had already experienced this when he had practiced the stellar body. But at the time, he had relied on the gravitational force of the stars to activate his perception to soar. And now, it was his physical body that was roaming the skies. This, however, was not his own strength. He was borrowing the power of the great world's repulsion. As he drew further and further away from the great world, his connection with it also grew weaker. A thought suddenly struck him at this. In the great world, he could freely transfer his power to any place in the world. But would he still be able to do it now that he had left the great world? Possessing the miraculous ability of transferring power made Zen invincible in this plane. No matter how strong the power was, it couldn't do any substantive damage to Zen, unless the power was so great that even the entire great world could not hold it in. The great world would be destroyed if the power were to be that strong. But would he still be able to do that after leaving the great world? As he thought this, Zen tried to transfer his power but in vain. He smiled wryly. The transfer of power was no longer effective. He had lost this important ability after he had left the great world. He felt a pang of regret but quickly recovered and became calm. After all, the transfer of power hadn't been his own ability, but was something that he had borrowed from the great world. For martial artists, their own strength was the most important. They could be strong for a while by relying on external force, but it wouldn't last long. If Zen relied too much on this ability, it would be difficult for him to fully cultivate. But though he couldn't transfer power, the memories of the great world still existed in his mind. He still maintained a faint connection with the great world, and could also look up events that had happened in the past as well as those that were happening in the present. So even after leaving this plane, Zen was still able to observe what Letitia and the others were doing. His physical body didn't travel as fast as his perception, and he was slower now than when he ascended through the Dragon Soar arena. He was like a leaf floating in the vast universe, drifting along with the wind. Zen had maintained the same posture for a few days. He had already seen the universe and the scenery it had to offer dozens of times. Now, he closed his eyes and observed the happenings in the cloud hall through the memories of the great world. He saw Letitia sitting in the ice palace, looking up at the sky dazedly, a sight that made his heart ache. He also saw the seriousness on Aura's face as she practiced meticulously. But where was Margaret? Why couldn't Zen see her? He sent this thought into the memories, but he was unable to find any trace of her throughout the great world. It was impossible for Margaret to ascend at her cultivation level. There was only one explanation for her absence: she had already gone to the Purple Power World. But why did she go to the Purple Power World? Zen was confused. Margaret had begun to speak hesitatingly ever since the old man from the celestial position had paid a visit. She must have been hiding something from him. He thought for a long time, and when he still couldn't figure it out, Zen had no choice but to let it go. Although she was obedient in front of him, she was born with stubborn willfulness and he had no control over what she wanted to do. It took him a full month to ascend all the way up. A month later, Zen's light suddenly dispersed and he rushed into a large black hole at a high speed. Just as he passed through the large hole, a loud noise sounded from above him. Boom! The sound rose to a deafening pitch, screeching through Zen's ears and almost causing him to faint. His mind went blank. He gradually recovered consciousness, and once he was completely awake, he found that he was lying in a square well. The clear water in the well was suffused with a light blue glow. The water was so clear that Zen could see the bottom. He felt a strange sense of comfort as he soaked in the clear blue water. But Zen was not alone. There were quite a few other people in the well. And just like Zen, they appeared to be clueless as to their whereabouts. Zen sized them up. All of them were at the Soul Sea realm, but it looked like they had just reached the realm. Their strength was far from that of Turner and War King Wind of the Divine Kingdom continent. They were even weaker than the three leaders of the Jade Martial House. Zen guessed that they had also flown here, and they had chosen to ascend as soon as they reached the Soul Sea realm. As the ascending passage in the Divine Kingdom continent had been destroyed, many of the Soul Sea realm powerhouses couldn't ascend. In such a long period of time, all of them had reached the middle stage or even the later stage of the Soul Sea realm. These warriors who had just reached the Soul Sea realm were much weaker than them. Is this the upper world? A warrior asked curiously after observing the well for a long time. Another person nodded and replied, it should be. But what about this square well? The others merely shook their heads. In a corner, a girl wearing plain clothes said, if I'm not mistaken, I think this is the ascending well. The ascending well? The others asked in union. The girl nodded and continued, I've heard that some of the upper world's sacred places would use the ascending well to bring warriors from all over the universe. And I think this is that ascending well. I just don't know which human sacred place we have ascended to. Must it be a human sacred place? What if it's another race's sacred place? A bearded man asked, eyebrows raised slightly. The plain-clothed girl answered him, it can't be, because there is a mysterious between link among different members of the same race. But I've also heard that there were indeed situations where warriors ascended into other races, supreme worlds. For example, if a human sacred place has just been taken away by the ogres, and we have ascended to this place, I'm afraid, she hesitated. Afraid of what? A tall, thin warrior prompted. The girl smiled faintly and said, we will have no chance of survival if we fall into the hands of the ogres. The others were taken aback at her words. In the lower world, only top-level powerhouses could reach the Soul Sea realm and ascend to the upper world. They had impatiently chosen to leave the lower world because they were eager to realize their ambitions. They wanted to reach higher realms and pursue supreme martial arts. But they would be doomed if they ascended into the wrong places, or even fell into the hands of the ogres or other cruel races. All of them were afraid of dying before they could even achieve something. The girl smiled at their expressions. Don't be afraid. This rarely happens. Our luck isn't that bad. Her gaze landed on Zen once she had finished speaking. How could he only have the cultivation of the life and death realm?